Hello guys, welcome to Soul Fiction. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto awakened the dragon of creation and destruction? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Dragon Beneath the Whirlpool. The skiff made hardly a sound as it skimmed the moon-bruised waves. Three shadows hunched low against the spray and the cold. Ruins rose around them like a drowned city's teeth, broken towers black with barnacles. Arches chewed thin by salt, spires snapped to jagged stubs. Somewhere beneath, the bones of Uzushio kept the tide busy writing and rewriting the same ragged story. Naruto kept his hand on the tiller. Eyes forward, the ocean's breath came steady. His did, too. You're sure this is the right vault? Karen asked without looking up from the seal map in her lap. She had a rain hood pulled low, red hair escaping in damp coils. The parchment glimmered faintly, Uzumaki spirals overlaid in her tight, spidery hand. Because if I'm going to drown tonight, I'd like a correct address. We won't drown, Hinata said, gentle and matter of fact. She sat opposite Karen, Byakugan pale in the low light, gaze burrowing past water, stone, the silted rooms beneath. 200 meters ahead, there's a vertical shaft like a throat. The entrance seal is cracked. Cracked like old pottery, Karen said, or cracked like, if you touch it the entire ocean remembers gravity with a grudge. Hinata's lips curved, a small smile that warmed without trying. The first one, probably. Karen huffed a laugh. Wonderful, comforting. Love the scientific precision, Hyuga. Naruto eased the tiller, bringing the skiff around a toppled pillar. The waves glowed faint where moonlight pooled in the troughs. He didn't answer right away, because the place felt like a held breath. And because when he opened his mouth, the air tasted different here. Bright, metallic, like the hum under a blade when it's sharp enough. Right vault, he said at last. The map from the monk in iron. The mark grandma left on the seal scheme. Your nose for Uzumaki trouble. Hinata's eyes were stacked, Karen echoed, and made it a dare. They cut the lantern. The skiff ghosted forward in near dark. Hinata reached out and nudged his knee with 2 fingers, a touch light as a moth. There, she whispered, pointing through the ruin of a stone arch where the water funneled into a black circle. Drop now. They anchored to a spine of old masonry, then shouldered packs, clipped lines. Naruto tightened the straps on Karen's harness, checked Hinata's, checked his own. Hinata checked them again without a word. They moved like people who'd done the dance too many times to trip over the music. You hate this part, Naruto said to Karen, because she always pretended otherwise and because it made her smile. Hate's a strong word, Karen said, showing teeth. Loathe is better. Hinata leaned in. If you need. I know, Karen said, and flashed Hinata a quick, wry look. You'll see me before I can even mess up. Before, Hinata said. Which was a strange promise if you didn't know her. With Hinata, before, meant during. Meant now. They slid over. The ocean took them in a cold grip. The shaft was a throat and a song. Naruto felt both at once. The stone had grooves cut in spirals, old marks filled with glimmering something that wasn't algae and wasn't light. Karen's hand found his wrist, strong and sure, and she squeezed once. Twice. Her code for depth and speed, then let go. Hinata glided a body length ahead, head turning in tiny, precise increments, eyes drinking everything the dark would show. Naruto loved the quiet here. Not because it lacked sound. The sea was a choir, but because the noise made sense. Rope creaked. Bubbles crept past his cheek. His own heart drummed steady. Down there, the world didn't judge a misstep in words. It simply answered with weight. The shaft opened into a vault hung with ribbons of seaweed and shards of collapsed ceiling. Bones of some great sea engine lay scattered in patterns that might have meant something if you were the person who'd built it. Karen would make it mean something anyway. That was what she did. She took the world's mess and forced it to confess its math. They landed on a lip of broken stone. Naruto drew a breath through the rebreather, set his feet, and held a hand out. It wasn't a seal. It wasn't anything he'd been taught. It was a shape his fingers wanted. The dead torch in the wall coughed a little light. Just a little. A pale mushroom glow licking up a soaked wick and clinging there like it had found a reason to exist after forgetting for a century. Naruto blinked. Hinata's head cocked minutely. Karen's eyes narrowed behind her lenses. Did you just? Karen began. Later, Naruto said, but he said it softly and not to end the conversation. He said it the way he said, careful, when he meant, I'm watching your back. They moved deeper. It wasn't a temple. It wasn't quite a vault, either. Naruto had tight corridors lined with seals and smug Uzumaki warnings about who should be allowed to open what and under what moon. Instead, the space felt like a lung, chambers opening into chambers, curve leading to curve. All of it centered around a round well full of blackness that tugged at the eyes. Karen crouched at the edge, palms hovering over the stone. Her breath fogged her lenses. Her voice muffled in the water skein between their rebreathers. Listen to this. The seals aren't words. Their pressure changes mapped as geometry. Whoever did this didn't want it read, they wanted it weathered. Hinata's hand brushed the well's lip like a blind person greeting a friend. There are channels, narrower than hair. They're vibrating. Good, Naruto said. Alive is better than dead and angry. He peeled off a glove and pressed his palm to the carved spiral running around the well. The stone was cold and slick. Below, the blackness didn't move, didn't glimmer, didn't acknowledge light even existed. Naruto closed his eyes and traced the spiral with chakra the way he'd been taught when he was small and stubborn and kept drawing them wrong out of spite. The stone warmed. The spiral tasted like salt. Something in the room paid attention. There are thresholds you don't cross because they're guarded. There are thresholds you don't cross because they'd be offended if you announced yourself. Naruto bowed his head just enough to count as respect. He sent chakra in a thread. He twisted that thread so it braided instead of stabbing. He fed it not with force but with steady insistence. The spiral took it. The well took it. The blackness didn't. Hold, Hinata murmured. Naruto. The pressure's shifting. He felt it a heartbeat later. A cold hand on his back knuckles, pushing in. Above them the ceiling groaned like a sleeping animal turning. In the shaft they'd come down, water surged and stilled, picking an argument with itself. Cracks in the far wall exhaled streams of bubbles. The room sighed. Here we go, Karen said, low and ferocious. The floor shuddered. Slots opened like mouths around the chamber and filaments whipped out, seals on the ends like paper knives, homing on heat. On chakra, on the mistake of breathing in the wrong place. Hinata was already moving, 2 fingers pressing under Naruto's wrist at one point, on his elbow at another. He felt her direction as much as saw it. Duck, twist, step left. And he did, and a filament sliced harmlessly through where his throat had been a second ago. Karen wasn't so lucky. 2 filaments brayed, detoured her from angles that made geometry curse. She flung a tag. It sparked in a frantic little dance and the threads juked around it like they were laughing. She grinned back, because of course they would. She rolled. One thread kissed her thigh. Blood smudged the water like paint. Naruto's chest went cold. He lifted a hand, intent snapping, a reflex old as fight and meaner than he liked, and ached for the new thing sitting coiled somewhere under his lungs. The something that could erase. No, he thought, as steady as he'd said, later, and as soft. Not that. He slapped his palm against the stone and breathed out. The breath wasn't air. It wasn't chakra the way he'd known it. It was a shape the world recognized and wanted. The wall bloomed. Calcite grew where there had been nothing, clear ribs arching out of hollows. Lattices knitting in a web that caught the slicing threads and held them like moths on a window screen. The growth fizzed against his hand, humming that weird metal sweet note he'd tasted on the boat. The filaments shivered, shuddered, went still. Karen landed hard on one knee, bared her teeth at the trapped threads, and then grinned up at him. That was either very clever or very stupid. Both, Naruto said. Hands quick, Hinata knelt and pressed her palm to Karen's thigh. Pale chakra bloomed under skin, slow and sure. Karen hissed between her teeth, then let the sound go. The room's pressure shifted again. All the hair on Naruto's forearms stood up. He turned back to the well. The black didn't move. That would have been easy. Instead, the black admitted there was a well, and that admission made an absence around itself, an outline in the shape of something long and coiled, something that might have had scales if the world had wanted to remember what scales were. The outline turned so whatever served as a head faced him. It asked nothing. Naruto had a lot of things he could have asked. How? Why? Who's left to clean up after you? Uzushio was good at mock-ing wonderful things and worse at making sure they wouldn't eat children later. He could have asked if it was the thing he'd been hearing in dreams, the breath like a drumbeat that wasn't his. Instead, he reached out a hand. Not with chakra and not with words, and not to touch. He did the thing he'd done since he was 12 and stubborn and stupid and unreasonably lucky. He made a promise to himself where someone else could hear it. I won't use you to erase people. The outline's edges sharpened. Not approval, acknowledgement. Naruto felt something curl through his lungs like steam in dawn air, except it wasn't hot. It was a breath that didn't belong to air. It moved into him like it had been waiting. Kurama stirred in his chest, old as thunder, old as loneliness. A growl rose and died. Not surrender. A squint. Recognition of an old kind of danger. Hinata's hand touched his shoulder. Naruto. I'm here, he said, and he was. The breath hadn't made him bigger or smaller. It had made the room fit differently. The calcite lattice began to crack. Not because it was weak, but because it had been meant to be temporary, a kindness to a problem, not a prison. Naruto didn't try to hold it. He let it shiver apart into harmless dust and rain away. Time to go, Karen said, voice steady. Before the vault remembers were from the outside. The well sighed again, and the shaft above them thumb. Head as something heavy settled somewhere in the ruin. Naruto exhaled into the spiral one last time in a shape like thanks. The outline uncoiled, or maybe the absence simply stood up, which made no sense and felt exactly right. It slid into the black in a curl of negative space and was gone. They climbed. The ascent wasn't smooth because the ruin had moods, and because whatever had slept down here didn't care about human convenience. Boulders shifted. A slow spiral of silt tried to lull them into forgetting why they were swimming. Hinata pointed without words and the current broke like a hinge. Karen's seal chalk bled off her gloves and stained the water the color of bad ideas. She wrote with it even so, sketching spirals on stone lips and muttering numbers like prayer. Halfway up the shaft, a wave thundered down. Water with fists, angry at itself. Naruto didn't think. He planted a foot on a rung of old iron, took hold of the wrist of the breath inside him that wasn't chakra and wasn't anything he had a word for. And erased the relationship between water and movement right there, in a pain that cut the shaft like a window. The wave hit that pain and hung like glass, a perfect curled shape frozen in place. Bubbles suspended like seeds. Above and below, 80 tons of ocean argued for the right to be in the same space. The iron rung bit his boot. The air in his rebreathe tasted sharp as lemons and lightning. Hinata's eyes were very wide and very calm. Left, she said, and they went left around the glass wave, slipping between two carved ribs of stone and coming out into a POC. Ket where the water had forgotten to be a crowd. Karen darted through, shoulders brushing rock, braid snapping like a live wire in the slowed eddies. The wave fell behind them when Naruto let go, not with a crash but with a sound like a hand unclenching. He didn't look back. He didn't press for anything more. A good trick was a good trick because you didn't ask it to be 5 good tricks. He'd learned that long ago from someone who drank too much and taught him to keep his promises anyway. They burst into air at the top of the shaft. The night had thinned toward morning. The horizon wore a smia of gray where the first hint of light would come. The skiff bobbed against the broken masonry where they'd tied it. Naruto flung his pack in, then Hinata's, then offered Karen a hand. She took it. Hen yanked his knuckles to her mouth and bit. He laughed, startled and pleased. Ow. And also, what? Chakra, she said around his skin, blood already slicking over her tongue. You're running a high drain on something I don't know how to measure yet. It's pinging my seals weird, and I hate not understanding what I'm working with. She let go, wiped the back of her hand across her mouth, and pushed a breath out that lit in the cold air. Her pupils were blown wide. The web of chakra under her skin flared clean, new energy bridging from her to him the way it had 100 times on 100 missions. Hinata was watching him, not worried, not worried, present. I'm good, Naruto said, and then amended because Hinata liked him better when he was honest on the first try. I will be Karen snorted and tucked her hood back. You better be. They're here. Naruto's head came up. He saw them then. Shapes along the ruins, low and clean and confident, the way good professionals moved. A man stood at the broken mouth of the shaft, hands behind his back, raincoat beating water like he'd personally ordered the droplets to behave. The fighters near him wore pale metal bands at their wrists and throats that didn't shine. Didn't dull. Did nothing except swallow the eye. Blades at hips and backs had the same not shine. Ministry, Karen said. Of course. Because when a thing hums, bureaucrats grow ears. Hinata's gaze went wider. Nullsteel, she said. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The man in the raincoat inclined his head. Naruto Uzumaki, he said, voice steady, exact L. Y pitched to carry over surf without sounding like he was trying. Hyuga, Uzumaki, Captain Sazanami, Ministry of Quietus. Thank you for doing the hard part for us. Please disarm your chakra and submit to containment. Please, Naruto said, eyebrows up. Sazanami's mouth twitched at the corner like he'd almost made a joke once and regretted it. We're all very grateful the war ended without the world ending with it. Our mandate is simple. When an imbalance awakens, we tend to it. There is a holding facility designed for people who make reality flexible. People, Karen echoed, under her breath. Charming. Do the cells get names? Quote. Hinata looked past Sazanami at the soldiers fanning out, at the pale weapons humming with no sound at all. She touched Naruto's sleeve, then let go. They have suppression fields in a ring 300 meters out, she said. Anchor points on the fallen spires. Naruto nodded, more to acknowledge that she'd said it than because he needed to hear it. He smiled at Sazanami, friendly. Can't do containment today. Our schedule's full. Of course, Sazanami said, as if they'd agreed about the weather. We anticipated that answer. Please don't make me test the width of my mandate. I prefer to keep everything neat. Naruto made a hand sign. A clone popped into being on the skiff's prow, then didn't, because the instant it was born it found its own edge and lost it. There was no puff, no smoke, no failure tell. One moment Naruto was two. The next there was the memory of a second person and then not even that. He let his smile go smaller. He didn't take his eyes off Sazanami. That's neat. Sazanami's gaze flicked to the empty place and back. Not gloating, not pitying, measuring. Please, he said again, and he meant it, and there was that earlier joke again at the corner of his mouth. Except this time it wasn't a joke. It was a small, clear request that believed in the possibility of being met halfway. Naruto loved that more than he should have. He hated it. It made saying no hurt a little. He bent his knees. Hinata, he said without turning. 3 anchors, she murmured. Left spire, toppled arch, submerged column. There's a 4th somewhere I can't see. Wind's coming in from the east. Karen, on your mark, Karen said, fingers already moving, pulling tags out of no space like a magician bored with stagecraft. I'll keep the anchors honest. Sazanami didn't call the charge. He didn't need to. The rings fired in sync with that neat, clean mandate of his. Silver-gray pulses shivering through the rain, not bright enough to be rude, not loud enough to panic anything. The air thickened, the kind of weight that made hand signs feel like pushing through wet cloth. Naruto drew breath. It wasn't a big breath. He didn't need to show off to people who were this good at their jobs. He stamped once and the sea said yes. Stone rose under the skiff like a board blooming from a carpenter dream, neat-grained and smooth, fit to someone's idea of a dock. Another stamp and the dock stretched. It wasn't a bridge, not exactly. Naruto had made enough of those in his life to know what they felt like in his spine. This was a boardwalk, a long, broad tongue of rock reaching out across broken water toward the black gap between 2 ruined towers where the sea ran fastest. Go, he said, and they were moving. The boardwalk wasn't just stone, it was a decision. Remade every second by the way he breathed. Naruto threw a look back over his shoulder and made another one. The water touching the underside of the stone forgot to drag. The bow. Aardwalk sighed forward as if it had decided to be a sled. Sazanami lifted a hand and the soldiers moved, quiet and precise, slipping along jagged ledges, boots eating distance with no wasted lean. The first volley wasn't projectiles. It was a lattice of those pale bands fired from something like crossbows, a net that didn't look like a net until it was already there. When it landed across the boardwalk, the world around them hiccuped. The air on Naruto's skin went from sharp to flat, the sense of yes that had been waiting under his toes went a fraction more reluctant. Karen flung a tag. It hit the nearest band and tried to take up space. The band didn't acknowledge that space was a thing. Karen bared her teeth. Rude. Hinata's fingers brushed the rail, then pointed. Under, she said, and Naruto made the boardwalk dip. The net slid overhead. There were shapes moving in the water to the right, anchors being hauled toward positions Hinata hadn't been able to see from the skiff. Naruto era, said the habit the water had of catching rope at the surface. The lines went slack as if embarrassed, the anchors overshooting, Sazanami's neat ring mistiming like a mind missing one beat. He didn't try to break it entirely. He didn't make the sea forget rope existed. He just shaved the edge off the efficiency. Let a plan miss its own clean corners. The next volley came hot. The pale bands bit into the boardwalk at intervals and a low, almost inaudible hum crawled into Naruto's teeth. Creation here weakened. His next step produced less stone and more nothing. He made less, then made differently. Fashioning the boardwalk in ribs instead of slabs, letting water breathe between like the bones of a fish. The ribs flexed and the sled moved faster. Hinata pointed again. Left spire down. Karen was already moving, scuttling on hands and feet over the boardwalk's going bones, because balance was for people who needed it. She slapped tags onto 3 ribs, then onto the stone tooth of a half-drowned arch as they shot past. Then onto the next rib. The tags lit in tiny, exultant blue. Lines zipped between them, ink sprinting, forming a spiral that wasn't about words at all, that was about naming a rhythm and enforcing it. The left spire's anchor shivered. The suppression ring faltered and filled with a squeal only people who lived with seals heard. Karen laughed, a bright, vulgar burst of pleasure that put heat at Naruto's back. Thank you, he said, and meant it. You don't get to erase my thanks, Karen said. It's the highlight of my week. Sazanami had moved to keep them in sight. With the grace of someone who had trained on impossible rooftops long enough to find them conceivable. He lifted one finger. The man beside him, helmet slung, eyes empty of everything except attention, drew a blade, and as he moved the blade's pale edge ate the tiny spray that hit it. The man took 3 running steps on the rim of a fallen tower, barely used the 4th, and landed on the boardwalk in front of them like a quiet ghost. Hinata, Naruto said. His chakras nested, she said, immediate. 4 flows, braided, weak link in his left knee. Noted. Naruto didn't slow. He couldn't. Bako, say slowing would let the suppression fields close back over them, and once those closed he suspected he'd learn more about what he could not do than he wanted to know. He made the ribs under the soldi. Dip as if the stone had suddenly remembered the soldier was heavier than the past allowed. The man compensated with admirable economy. Hinata stepped forward and struck him once, 2 fingers, an inch. A kiss of pressure, and his braided flows slipped. He didn't fall, not exactly. He became a problem for the ocean instead of for them. She caught his collar at the last second and set him gently on a rib that would carry him back toward Sazanami's ruined tower. She did it without comment and without triumph. Naruto loved her with a clean, uncomplicated warmth he didn't need to name. Ahead, the black gap between the towers was narrowing. The suppression ring's 4th point had finally locked in. Hinata had found it because it had found them, and now the air around his teeth tasted like paper. The boardwalk wanted to stop being. He could make it be, but doing that would be like asking a friend to keep laughing after their throat was raw. Under, he asked. Hinata didn't answer. She was squinting at the water itself, eyes pulling the world apart into threads. There's a pocket. It's not deep. That current. She circled a finger. It's like the shaft. It's remembering how to move. We can borrow that memory, Naruto said. And Hinata's mouth made a small surprised shape as if he had plucked the thought straight from her. Karen spat blood over the rail and smeared a fresh swipe across her palm. Allow me to tune the borrowing. She slapped her palm to the rail. The spiral she drew was ugly and perfect and angrier than anything that belonged on a dock. Naruto felt the world around them shiver in tiny, particular ways. Hinata nodded. Once. Naruto exhaled. then inhaled in a shape he hadn't known he knew, and the boardwalk dove. They slid into the gap. Stone ribs became a tongue-cutting water, then a swallow. Then a thought. For 3 breathless seconds the world narrowed to movement and trust. Karen's hand clamped the rail. Hinata's shoulder pressed against Naruto's. The 3 of them breathed together and the boardwalk moved because they did. Pale bands hissed overhead like snakes that had just remembered they were too slow to bite what they wanted. They came up hard in a spill of foam on the far side of the ring. The boardwalk hit a new shape of water and Naruto felt something in his chest overextend, like a muscle doing more than it should and grinning about it anyway. He grimaced and let the stone fall back into sea. The skiff bobbed free and sped on its own small courage. They had open water in front of them now and a cliff like a whale's back 200 meters ahead where the ruin gave way to the honest coast. "Captain," one of the soldiers called. Naruto didn't hear the word so much as saw the shape of it in the man's mouth. Sazanami lifted 2 fingers in. The air in the ring of suppression pulsed, then collapsed neatly inward. The pale bands retracted with the quiet joy of tools going back into their foam-cut slots. Neat. Efficient. A part of Naruto's brain that enjoyed tidy things admired it. Another part catalogued options. "We're going to make it," Karen said, breathless and annoyed at being breathless. "At which point I will be insufferable for a week." "Hinata?" Naruto asked. Her eyes were white fire. 3 more units on the cliff. 2 with gauntlets. 1 with the pale cannon. "Cannon," Karen said. "That seems unfair." "Life's unfair," Naruto said, happy. The first shot from the cannon was almost polite. It made no thunder. It made a correction, a puck of air where everything else yielded, and it came at them on a straight line. Naruto didn't try to block the shot. He erased the friction between the shot and the air instead, which did 2 odd things. 1, it made the shot overshoot by a fraction. 2, it made the wake behind the shot blossom into eddies that folded over on themselves in curlicues like ribbon. The second shot hit those curlicues and lost confidence. By the time the third came, Karen had thrown 3 tags into the path and drawn a spiral leyline across where the curlicues wanted to be. The third shot made a tired little sound as if it had remembered a better plan, then wandered off. Sazanami watched this with that same impersonal interest, like a man who had seen a new technique performed well and filed it beside all the other techniques he'd seen. When Naruto glanced back their eyes met across water and ruin and mandate. Sazanami did not order a volley at the skiff's hull. He didn't aim for the engine. He didn't aim for Hinata's exposed profile or for Karen's busy hands. He didn't aim at Naruto's heart. Somewhere long ago someone had taught him where to aim in order to end a fight clean. He did not choose that. Naruto lifted his hand instead of looking away, a small, thoughtless wave. Sazanami huffed something that might have been a half-second of unwilling amusement, then lifted his own. They hit the lee of the cliff and the first fingers of dawn were starting to go pink in the east where the sky thought about morning. Naruto didn't pull the skiff up far. He wanted the ocean near. He wanted the tight, true breath of it next to him while he found out whether he'd made a mistake waking. Something with outlines instead of edges. They climbed the rocks. Hinata went first, hands and feet finding the right holds with the right calm pressure. Naruto went next. Karen swore at a barnacle in a way that suggested deep history and then made the barnacle regret its life choices. They reached a shelf of stone that looked out over the ruin and the water and, beyond, the thin line between night and something less. Naruto breathed. The breath snagged, not in pain, but because there was too much of it. Something in him had learned a rhythm and now the world around him tried to match it. Air W. Ent still in a circle out from where he stood. The waves below paused mid-crest. Spray hung like a net of pearls cut from strings. The ruin didn't move. Even the gulls didn't dare test to flap. There were 3 heartbeats in the whole world. Hinata's, steady. Karen's, irritated and fast and strong. His. On the 4th heartbeat, the ocean remembered itself. It hit the rocks with a sound like a crowd, cheering quietly at a game no one knew the rules to but everyone wanted to win. Naruto let his breath out and his shoulders came down with it. Karen watched the water settle. "Well," she said at last. "That's new." Hinata stepped in close. She didn't touch him until he looked. Then she reached up and rested her fingertips along his jaw the way she did when he'd gone too fast, too far. Not to chastise. To remind him she existed and that existence liked him. You're all right, she said. He nodded. He was. He would be. He had to be the kind of man who said both and meant them. Down on the broken tower where the ministry had arranged itself, Sazanami watched the same pause of the ocean, the same bright breath lengths. He tucked his hands deeper into his raincoat pockets. The wind tried to lift his hair and gave up. Then we're already late, he said, very quietly, to the ruin and the gulls and the pale bands he commanded. No one answered, because he wasn't asking. Naruto didn't hear him. He stood on the cliff with Hinata's touch cooling on his jaw and Karen's blood starting to dry in a line down his knee where she'd grabbed him climbing. The sun rose an inch. The waves kept their promises. The breath in his chest coiled and uncoiled like a sleeping thing, unsure if it was the reason for dawn or just happily nearby. He grinned, a little breathless, and because there was no one to mock. Speeches to and nothing that called for them, he said the only thing that fit the size of the morning. Okay, he murmured, let's see if we can make this a good story. Behind them the coast road ran toward the desert. Ahead of them, the drowned bones of a nation glimmered like wet teeth. Somewhere in between, a man in a raincoat with neat hands made plans he would carry out with care. Above, the sky considered opening twice. Hinata lowered her hand. Karen shouldered him with all the subtlety of a brick and then pretended it hadn't been affectionate as she went by. Naruto laughed once, sharp and bright, and it came out of him like a promise kept. They turned toward the path down. The skiff bumped the stone gently, asking if it was still invited. The day, as always, gave them nothing except what they took with intent. They took the first steps like people who recognized weight and didn't fear it, and the ocean went on breathing as if it had learned something new and wasn't sure yet whether to be proud. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. A wind of knives across the dunes. By noon the heat over Suna's stone courtyards looked like the air was trying on another skin. Flags clacked lazily on their poles. Dust prowled in the alleys. Thin as rumor and twice as persistent. In the council chamber, polished sandstone and shadows shared the room like old rivals called to the same table. Tamari Lee, Ned, both palms on the map spread across the center. Someone had inked a neat spiral off the coast beside the stylized ruin of Uzushio and scrawled in the margin, Ocean paused 3 heartbeats. A doodle, of a gull with a stunned expression rested next to it, which was either humor or testimony. She didn't look at the gull. She looked at the incoming trio, the blonde with the relaxed shoulders that hid the readiness of a bowstring. The Hyuga stepping as if the world would forgive her anything because she always meant well, the redhead with ink on her fingertips and no patience for anyone's preface. Uzumaki, Tamari said. Hyuga, Uzumaki. Karen supplied before Tamari could add an adjective. Right, Tamari said, but her eyes had already moved back to Naruto. You paused the ocean. Nah. Ruto's expression was friendly in a way that could be mistaken for simple if you wanted it to be. It paused, he said. I didn't do it alone. Tamari executed a small nod that covered respect, skepticism, and a willingness to be proven wrong, all in one movement. She tapped the map. Our survey teams are evacuating material from 3 peripheral sites. Her finger hit 3 marks along an old TRA. The road skirting the desert's southern belly. We think the Ministry of Quietus will try to interdict those convoys en route to the sand glass. That gives them leverage and a propaganda win. Karen slid a glance at Naruto. And, we, are supposed to be bait. Correction, Tamari said dryly. Bait with agency. Suna will provide a contingent and air cover. You 3 handle what my shinobi are not built to handle, nullsteel. Anti-pattern zones, and bureaucrats who want to write their policies onto our throats. Naruto's smile tilted. Bureaucrats with swords, he said. Neat. Tamari didn't return the smile. I don't like surprises in my sky. If you can keep the ocean obedient, the dunes should be a polite conversation. She let the implication hang there like a test and stepped back. Depart in an hour. We stage at the Howler Spine by sundown. Karen planted a hand on the map, fingers splaying across one of the marked routes until ink smudged her skin. In case it was unclear, she said pleasantly. My patience for being told to just do the miracle again evaporated in childhood. Tamari met her stare. Good, she said. I prefer people whose patience has already failed. They work faster. Hinata's voice came soft and even. The suppression anchors will be placed on high points, dune crests, rocky outcrops. If we can locate 3, there will be a 4th in a blind sector. Tamari's head tipped the fraction that meant she'd noticed something useful. That matches what our scouts reported from a skirmish near Port Yanket. They lost a Jonin to a ring they didn't see close. I don't intend to repeat their mess. Naruto rested a finger on the map and drew a quick line with the nail, cutting empty space between 2 trade routes. We won't take the road. We'll make one. Temari's gaze sharpened. He wasn't being dramatic. He said it the way a carpenter might tell you where he was going to put the door. Do it, she said. Results impress me more than sentences. They met again. An hour later in the glare outside Suna's eastern gate. The city's shade fell away like a favor rescinded and the world beyond became a white stage. Dunes, ruined walls baked brittle, the sky a sheet of hammered copper. Suna shinobi checked straps and clicked canteens. Sand sleds splayed out under tarps, ready to be dragged over grit. Above, 3 wind riders in pale cloth drifted on wide-wing kites. Temari's people keeping lazy watch with cutthroat attention. Tamari walked up with her battle fan slung at her back, hair coiled like a promise. She didn't offer her hand to Naruto. He didn't offer his. Instead he crouched and began to draw in the dust with a stick while Karen appended a canteen to darken the ground. Hinata stood, head tilted, eyes distant and very present. Naruto sketched fast. A caravan's string, here. Dune crests in washed brown. Possible anchor points in little crossed squares. He pressed his thumb to 4 spots and smudged them. Hinata, he said. High points, yes. That ridge, she pointed. A basalt spine. Good line of sight for the far side. And that dead well there. If they have a cannon, they'll nest it into the well mouth to keep wind from fouling the shot. Karen took the stick. Her lines were messier and more true, congested with annotations that looked like curses to anyone else. She drew an Uzumaki spiral over the basalt spine and slashed through it. I can make a ley line that introduces error into their timing if we force them to fire through it. We'll need a moving platform here and here so I can braid tag anchors as we go. Tamari watched our impromptu chalk and string stir into shape with that particular expression she and her brothers had. Amusement in the eyes, calculating in the mouth. You build while you move, she said. Fine, I'll keep the air civilized. Naruto glanced up at her. The desert keeps score, right? It keeps receipts, Tamari said, and if there was an edge of humor there, she kept it aligned with the edge of her fan. They moved at dusk. The heat didn't leave so much as loosen its grip, the sky bleeding from copper to bruised violet. The caravan slid out, a string of sleds and creaking wagons loaded with lead crates that hummed faintly to Naruto's new scents, like faraway singing bowls. Evacuees huddled under cloth. Academics, craftsmen, a boy wrestling solemnly with a satchel larger than his ribcage, his mother's hand a tether to the present. Tamari ranged ahead with 2 Suna Jonin, her fan folded, her silhouette against the sky spare and exact. Naruto matched pace with the lead sled, Hinata at his shoulder. Karen moved along the line, tacking tags onto harness rings and axle rods, scolding a wheel like it owed her rent. They left the trade road. Naruto stamped once, twice, hands low, breath measured. Sand that wanted to drift into chaos briefly recalled a different law, it held shape. A hardpack path curled out in front of the caravan like a river remembering bedrock. The sled runners whispered over it, grateful. Hinata's hand bumped his forearm, a not quite accident. Your eyelashes, she said, quiet, so only he heard. He blinked, then laughed under his breath at the delicate lace of light that shook free from his lashes. Like tiny petals caught and deciding they had somewhere else to be. Creation's winning, he murmured. And proud of itself, she said, mouth curving. Keep it even. He adjusted without thinking, easing off the breath that made things want to be and letting the other breath, cool, precise, rise in its place. The petals stopped their shed. Tamari drew back alongside, eyeing the path. All this for a convoy. All this, Naruto said, for a story where nobody dies for our convenience. Romantic, Tamari said, but she didn't sound like she was making fun. She wheeled her kite riders with a flick of a hand. They rose, small and dark, stitching wind. The ambush came at the second watch, when the sky was a quilt of stars and cold had crept in against everything that sweated. It started beautifully. The air went clear and fine, the way it does before a storm that intends to be remembered, and then the first Astra banner dropped from the heavens, point first. It bit the sand with the satisfyingly soft sound of something very sharp entering something that wanted to claim it, and then it unfolded. Pylons grew from its shaft, petals, ribs, each one humming N.O.T. quite in any key as they locked into an array. The night warped a little around it, not in a showy way, but the way a lie warps a conversation. Hinata's breath clouded in a circle too precise to be weather. 1, she said, and then 2, 3. The second and third banners speared down behind and to the right of the caravan. A fourth did not show, which meant it was wherever you didn't want it to be. The air pulled thin. Naruto made a shadow clone out of old habit and watched it unmake, not violently but politely, like a guest excusing themselves before the bill came. Karen, he said. Already, she snapped, flinging herself at the nearest sled axle. Tags slapped, ink crawled, hungry. Her sealed lines leapt between the sleds and reached for ground that tried to refuse the words. She grinned like this was the exact argument she'd wanted to have tonight. Tamari snapped her fan open once. The sound cut the air in half. Wind rose, not the broad, lazy wind that wandered deserts, but a narrow, surgical draft that Tamari shaped with flicks of her wrist. It went around the evacuees and over the sleds and slammed into the banners. The pylons shuddered as the air itself lost interest in obeying their geometry, only to regain it an instant later with cold conviction. Riders, Tamari called up, and her two stayed exactly where they were, watching the sky, hands light on reins, the picture of discipline. She cut her eyes at Naruto. The fourth, Hinata's gaze sharpened. Buried, she said, pointing left. 20 paces under, in the edge of that dune. Naruto slapped his palm to the hardpack path he'd made and erased the relationship between the buried metal and the patience of sand. The dune coughed up the fourth banner in a dry heave, confused, shafts splayed, anchor lines writhing like startled snakes. Temari's fan came down like a judge. Wind hammered the exposed metal sideways. The anchor lines tangled with the second banner's ribs in a gratifying clatter. Shouts came from the dark. Low, controlled. Figures flowed along the edges of the dunes, their wrists and throats pale with that unshine that ate the moon. Nullsteel cavalry, moving with a speed that said their training had stunt doubles and dead ends. Naruto raised a hand and did something small. He erased the grid in a cone around Hinata's eyes. The world snapped into crisp lines for her. Thank you, she said, and her voice stayed calm even when a nullsteel blade kissed the air an inch from her forearm without gleaming. He stepped in to meet the first of them. He didn't try to rip their weapons apart. He didn't try to lay them to waste. He made the sand under their feet remember bedrock so they slipped. He made the drag behind them increase so that their elegant lunges arrived half a heartbeat late. He absorbed a cut across his sleeve where a pale blade sewed emptiness through his cloak and answered by creating a step under the attacking man's trailing heel. The man stumbled, and Hinata was there, 2 fingers and a whisper. And he sat down in the way people do when their tenketsu have been persuaded to take a holiday. Karen shouted and the caravan's middle went bright, 3 spirals lit up. Sprinting ink knitting an ad hoc net over wagons. Suna shinobi took the seams with ropes and spears and their own breath steady in their chests. Don't get cocky, Tamari muttered, then launched herself 10 paces sideways. Fan slashing down to split a lance of air fired from one of the banners. Wind bit wind. The lance shattered like a glass dropped politely. 2 of the ribs whined a little, indecisive, then pulsed harder. Trying to reassert the ring. Regent Hashira made his entrance as a voice. It came from the banners, not through speakers or seals but through the way the sand hummed in its own throat. It did not introduce itself. It did not threaten anything. It simply began outlining contingencies as if to itself, the way a person who had spent too long running an army might mutter battle hymns in the bath. Positions shifted accordingly across the ministry line, quick, the kind of response that made other commanders jealous and their subordinates either love them or die for them, or both. Naruto tried to lay another strip of hardpack and watched it refuse him. Creation fell away from his fingers not with resistance but with no interest at all. The air tasted like paper, like a form filled out in triplicate. The banners had asserted a little law of their own. He felt something cold gather at the edge of his lashes. He reached up and brushed it away without looking. Frost. He was leaning into the dusk breath too hard. He was letting destruction do the entire dance because creation had decided to be offended. Tamari saw him fail to make the ground and said, without taking her eyes off the dust storm she was shaping, "If you can't build, break what they trust." He laughed, "A quick, sharp thing. Borrowing your words. Return them clean," she said. He reached not for the banners. Not for their ribs or their tidy circles, but for the echo that was passing between them, the way they were keeping time with each other. The breath inside him that wanted to pull threads apart did so, gently. Naruto erased the relationship between the second and third banner's pulse cadence, the piece of habit that made two metronomes tick in sympathy when placed on the same shelf. They kept ticking. Oh. They did, but one tick didn't comfort the other now. A pulse arrived when its partner had already moved on. A volley fired half a second before the order truly meant it. The Nullsteel Sea. Avalry found themselves lunging into spots that suddenly had no support, and Temari's wine neatly extracted one from his own overreach and set him down far from the fight, like a mother who did not believe in letting children learn by concussions. "Better," Tamari said briskly, approving. The iron barrel rose beside the dead well just as Hinata had said it would, pale and wrong, the air whistling around its mouth as if the night were being taught to pronounce a foreign letter. The first shot trembled the world so subtly you could miss it if you hadn't already learned how things felt when they almost forgot to be. Karen flung a tag and drew a spiral at her feet with the edge of her other palm and made the ground under the cannon's line of fire care about error. The shot kissed that spiral's edge and lost self-confidence. It still came on. Naruto erased friction in a fence for it to plow through. It continued, but it arrived late enough for Tamari to step aside and only lose a lock of hair, which she did not deign to acknowledge. "Pincer," Naruto said, seeing it before it arrived, the ministry line splitting, two prongs curling around the caravan's front and rear. He measured the point where he could intervene and found too many. The breath inside him surged. Minato would have moved. Jiraiya would have distracted. Tsunade would have punched a hole and dared the world to call it a mistake. Naruto almost went for the trick that would prove he was still the boy who ran ahead of the plan. Temari's head snapped toward him. "Don't hero the pincer," she said. "They want you there so the rest collapses." He stopped. "Just the smallest arrest of momentum, but real. Plan then," he said. "Structure," she said, and grinned, quick and wolfish. "You're good at pretending a thing was always supposed to be there. Do that. I'll give you wind where you want it." Karen knit him a spine. "On it," Karen said, already sprinting along the front sled, slapping tags to the boards like she meant to spank a dragon. Naruto breathed a shape into the world that wasn't a wall. It had holes, lanes, honesty. Sand rose in a honeycomb of ribs and braces, wide enough for sleds, narrow enough for cavalry to hate. It wasn't a castle. It was a machine for directing motion, and he placed it not just to block but to tempt. Temari's wind took that machine in hand and lifted its edges a fraction, enough that the ribs flexed without breaking. Enough that the structure could ride, sliding with the caravan like a shell grown out of travel itself. The ministry's pincer hit an arm of that moving fortress, and found itself cut into slices. Here a narrow file only two could pass. There a low arch that forced riders to duck and break line of sight. Above, a vent where Temari's air shredded their neat volume. Lay before it remembered how to be a volley. Hinata called cadence like a commander disguised as a gentle person. Left lane tightening. Two in the blind behind the third sled. Archer on the well. It's a relay carrier. Karen. Already. Karen panted, laughing a little because the math was doing that thing where it sang. She knelt, tagging ribs, tags snapping to attention, ink lines sprinting to find each other because she had promised them they would. A net crawled over the moving structure, not to capture but to define. Definition hurt the banners. Briefly, their pulses had to start acknowledging that something else had an opinion. A Nullsteel rider got past Hinata's elbow and Tamari's side and let the wind take his blade. It flew end over end into a dune with a muffled thunk. He stared at his empty hand. The shock of anyone whose entire plan had been to do the thing he'd been told would always work. Naruto slid in, shoulder to sternum, and set him down gently. He would wake later with a story about a desert that had been rude and sensible. The banners shifted. Hashira's voice, smooth as a lawful document, altered tempo. The no-pattern zone tightened, drew down like a noose. Creation, which had been cooperative within Naruto's shape machine, began to stiffen, the ribs less eager to be. He could brute force it. He could pour dawn breath into the structure until it glowed and sang. Jian exhausted him in a burst of petal-shed light that would leave his team carrying his stubborn body for him. Or he could be left Lord's student and adjust. He didn't pour. He went small again and erased the habit of fear beginning to collect like fine dust in the throats of the civilian teamsters crammed under the moving ribs. Not all of it. He wouldn't take their caution. Just the part that kept a hand from steadying a wheel or a mind from choosing a lane. The moving machine steadied in response as if everyone aboard had remembered that they had hands. Tamari barked a laugh. "That's cheating," she said, meaning, "Do it again." "Smart boy." The cannon coughed a third time. Karen's leyline bent the round. Hinata's call made the driver of the fourth sled jink left. Naruto erased the relation ship between a loose coil of rope and the axle so it unwound into the path of an oncoming rider like a lazy snake with perfect timing. The rider hit the rope with such certainty he made a noise of her feelings and landed in a long slide that ended in him lying on his back, staring up at stars that had no sympathy. For a moment everything aligned. The moving fortress slid into the shape of a corridor Tamari had cleared. The banners, ticks disagreed with their own hands. Hashira's neat commands arrived a hair too late for bodies that did not know how to negotiate with late. The caravan flowed. Naruto felt his breath balance. Frost gone, petals asleep. His chest made a sound he wasn't sure was a sound or simply the world congratulating him for a well-timed restraint. He did try to hero once. The ministry's left flank found a seam. He saw it the way a builder sees a weak beam before the roof collapses, and his body was already in the air to close it when Temari's voice cracked over the din, "Uzumaki." He caught himself on the edge of a rib and hung there, surprised that stopping could be a choice as decisive as leaping. Tamari didn't gloat. She gestured with her fan, pivoted the wind, and made the seam move. The flank lunged for where the weakness had been because people often lunge for memory. They found it filled with sand the desert had decided not to share anymore. When the ministry finally pulled back, they did it with professional grace. Banners folded, ribs coiling into their own shafts. The cannon vanished into its well with the silence of a guilty conscience. The cavalry retreated in clean lines. Hashira's voice didn't leave a signature. The moving fortress slowed. Naruto let it dissolve ahead of the caravan, not in a workmanlike collapse but in a small, polite easing, sand resuming its rights. No longer convinced it needed to be architecture. He exhaled in the old way and tasted dust and his own salt. Soon medics moved through the convoy like good ghosts. Karen plopped down on the tongue of a sled and lay back with her arms thrown wide, chest heaving. Ink had dried black and cracked at the edges on her palms and along her wrists to the elbow, a map of her argument with the banners. She grinned up at the night and said, "To no one and everyone, my line sang." Hinata walked past Naruto, the small med pack at her hip riding light. She tilted his chin and NSPECTED the line where a nullsteel edge had trimmed the cloth at his shoulder. "You nearly slipped," she said softly. "Tamari yelled at me," he said. It helped. Hinata's mouth made a ghost of a smile. "She's good at a useful kind of mean." Tamari was standing on a dune crest, staring toward the far horizon where the ministry had gone. Wind tugged at her sash and found nothing else to push. Naruto went to join her. "Your machine moved," she said without preamble. "I cheated," he said. "Good," she said. "I hate fair fights." They watched the caravan adjust itself in the long valley below, SLEDs creaking into a defensive ring as the Suna shinobi set a perimeter with the casual competence of people who'd done it so many times they only needed 4 words and a finger to build an outpost out of night. Tamari glanced sideways at him. "I've seen men give orders because they like the sound of their voices. They're useful as shields. I don't think you like the sound of yours." "I like when it makes things easier for other people," Naruto said. "I like when nobody has to pretend they're not afraid." "Useful," Tamari said, approving like she'd found the right tool in the bottom of a dusty drawer. You take advice mid-fight. You make other people's ideas look better than your own. You didn't erase anyone you could have erased. She folded her fan and planted it in the sand like a stake. I'll be your liaison to the council. Don't make me regret it. He offered her nothing grand, because grand was boring. You'll regret the sand in your boots before you regret me. Temari's mouth tilted. The desert keeps receipts, she said again, then added, as if she'd been saving it, and it forgives people who clean up afterwards. They camped light under a black sky so full of stars it looked like someone had spilled a bucket of them on purpose. Suna's fire discipline was severe. Small braziers shone like lonely eyes, tucked low. The evacuees ate thin stews and laughed the laughter that comes back to your ribs to see if you'll be allowed to keep it. Naruto sat on a folded blanket and rolled his shoulders. Everything in him felt used in the good way, like the aftermath of building AF. Ends fast because the storm had come early and you had beaten it by a minute. Hinata knelt in front of him and wrapped his knuckles with bandage, hands sure. She didn't speak until she tied the last knot. You make it easy to stand close, she said, as if this were as factual as the weather. Her eyes slid away before he could answer, not shy, giving him room he could step into when he wanted. Karen approached with 2 canteens and all the grace of a cat considering knocking over a priceless vase. You're out of balance again, she informed Naruto, and thumped him lightly on the sternum with the heel of her hand. Creation staining your chakra in little petals. Pretty. Stupid. Working on it, he said, content. Temari lowered herself onto the other end of his blanket without asking and without apology. She set her fan within arm's reach like an anchor. Karen, she said, as if testing the sound of it. You going to keep lecturing him or fix it? Karen shoved a canteen at Naruto. Drink. Slowly. Think boring thoughts while you do it. What counts as boring? Naruto asked. Paperwork, Temari said immediately. Documenting supplies, Hinata offered, eyes warm. Other people's romance, Karen said. Tone indecently satisfied when Hinata choked on a laugh. Naruto drank. The breath inside him that liked dawn and the breath that liked dusk settled into each other like cats forced to share a chair. He felt the cold at the corners of his lashes recede. No more stray light drifted off his edges. Better, Karen said grudgingly, then glanced at Temari. You don't actually hate fair fights. Temari's gaze had drifted to the sky. I hate fights that pretend to be fair, she said. I like fights where our side goes home. Their fire guttered low. Wind worried the edge of the camp and then thought better of it. Someone across the ring began to snore with a sound like a goat's opinion. The bell sounded after midnight. Not the thin chime of a dinner gong or a caravan signal. This was deeper, tied to bone and winter. It came from the direction of the ruined waystation a quarter-mile beyond the perimeter, a box of stones the desert hadn't bothered to bury because it liked the company. Temari was on her feet with the first note, fan in hand. Suna Shinobi rose like grass remembering it should be taller. Naruto stood and felt a wrongness in the way the air sat, not active, not restrictive, just perfectly balanced. Too perfectly. Hinata's hand found his sleeve. There, she said, and her voice was the most careful he had heard it all night. By the well, silhouette. A man in robes cut simple enough to pass anywhere, not Suna, not fire, not anything but restraint. He held the bell rope in one hand. He was not hiding, and he was not presenting himself. He was not anything except inarguably present. The air around him had a texture. Naruto's breath met it and slid off like a knife turning on glass. For a few seconds the desert went quieter than deserts should, even the insects forgot their arguments. Friend of yours? Temari asked, and her voice said she would use friend in the way a mason uses, hairline crack. Naruto didn't answer. The man's head turned a fraction in their direction, no speed. No threat display. He was attentive the way you attend to a book you know will be hard. The bell rope moved a finger's breadth. Hinata's shoulders squared without anyone seeing it. Karen rolled her wrists to shake the ink dry and readied 3 tags in a fan. Temari slid her bare feet into the sand and sure-handed her fan open a fraction, not enough to show anything but intent. The bell didn't ring again. The man let the rope fall and set his palm against the well stones as if greeting an old friend. He stood there a long breath and then stepped back, not retreating, not advancing. He raised 2 fingers in the barest, oldest version of a monk's bow, one that admitted the existence of others without putting your neck where anyone could take it. Then he dissolved into the kind of stillness that wasn't disappearance but admission. The desert was already full. It had no room for him, and so it made room. He wasn't there, one of the Sunajanan whispered, rattled in a way seasoned soldiers hate. And then he had always been there. Tamari exhaled through her nose like a horse deciding not to kick. Well, she said, thin and wry. That's a new problem. Naruto stared at the well where the man had been. He didn't feel threatened. He felt recognized, like a violin listens to a cello and hears the same wood, the same string, 2 different ideas of what music is for. We move at dawn, he said, before the ministry decides they've learned enough for one night. Tamari didn't ask why he said ministry, when the man had looked like a monk from the old iron roads. She had already made that leap on her own. Her eyes were very clear in the starlight. They went back to their blankets and their watches and their thin sleep that night with the bells not stuck in their bones like a shard of cold sunrise. Naruto lay on his side and watched Hinata blow out a breath and tuck her hands under her cheek. Karen slept on her back with her mouth open, handsome in a dare you way even unconscious. Tamari sat marked out in the darkness by the profile of her fan, awake while pretending not to be. The desert didn't say a thing. It had seen people larger than anyone flung the word legend and do their small errands and then forget what the errands were for. It could wait. Naruto closed his eyes and counted the heartbeats he could hear. His own, Hinata's steady, the caravan's weary. The faint echo of the bell rolling around a well that had never meant to be a throat. He breathed in a shape that offered no one a promise but himself, and he slept. Dawn found them already moving. They slipped through the badlands where rock rose like broken ribs and the wind remembered how to complain. The ministry did not reappear that morning. The caravan reached the sand glass, Suna's outpost carved into a narrow cliff, and spilled into its safety with the relief of people who had carried their homes in boxes for too long. Tamari peeled off to file reports with a pace that said she hated writing as much as she loved precise language. Karen bullied 2 medics into giving her their good tape and then sat on a barrel and wrapped her own hands with the vanity of someone who knew they looked better with interesting damage. Hinata stood with her eyes closed for a long minute, head tilted, listening to the world's flows like a physician listening to a heart. She opened them and smiled, satisfied that the world still had one. Naruto stood under a lintel and watched the road behind them for a long time. He didn't know what he expected to see. The monk's silhouette, Sazanami's neat raincoat making the desert look like a place where rain might happen. A banner falling out of the sky like a needle meeting cloth. Instead he saw a boy trotting after a spilled blanket, hair sticking up from bad sleep and good dreams. The boy caught the blanket. The blanket caught the boy. His mother caught them both with the soft violence of love. Naruto let his shoulders drop. He turned into the heart of the outpost where Tamari was already ordering reality into an after-action brief that would make the council feel smart for sending her. I meant it, she said without looking up when he stepped into the same patch of shade. About being liaison. I know, he said. She scratched a note, a swift, slanted line. I will, however, continue to test you. He laughed. I'd be disappointed if you didn't. Her eyes flicked up and did a quick, professional inventory of his face. Your lashes, she said. Even, he said. Good, she said, and the smile was there this time. Small and sharp and more dangerous than most blades he'd met. Let's see how long we can keep them that way. A courier arrived in the afternoon with a crisp message that smelled faintly of rain and neatness. Tamari broke the seal. The wax crumbled in tidy flakes. From iron, she said, skimming. Meet at the border of the old monastery road. Ministry movements increasing. Reports of a pocket eye. And the sky that does not agree with weather. Her lip curled, amused and disdainful in equal measure. They're using geography like a meeting invite. Naruto rubbed his thumb and forefinger together, feeling grit. We'll go. Tamari folded the message and slid it into her vest. Nightfall. Fewer eyes. Hinata's gaze went distant again, and when she spoke her voice had that careful attentiveness to T meant she was weighing 2 true things and picking the kinder. The man last night, she said. He didn't try to take anything. He set the bell to measure us. Sounds like a man who wants to talk, Karen said, slinging her bag over her shoulder. Or like a man who hopes we'll talk while he listens and makes a ledger. Either way, Tamari said, we'll bring our own paper. They left the sand glass at dusk. The desert, patient, made no comment. The night hung warmer than the last, like a hand over a bowl to keep the steam in. Stars sparked with their old professionalism. At the ruined way station, the bell hung quiet. The well accepted that it was a well. The man was not in sight. Naruto stepped into the open and exhaled once. The breath did not try to change the way the sand held together or the manner in which the wind moved. It simply went out of him and into the world and made no ripples. He waited. Tamari waited. Hinata's hands hung loose at her sides. Karen watched the corners. F the dark, because that's where math hides its pride. The monk slid into being not from behind a wall or out of a shadow, but by becoming the thing that refused to distract the eye, at exactly the speed of attention. He might have been handsome if you wanted him to be. He might have been plain if that was easier. Evening, Naruto said. You rang. The man tilted his head, faint surprise at the corner of his mouth. Like someone discovering a page number where they liked it. When he spoke, his voice wasn't loud and it wasn't soft. It had the honesty of a bell. I am called Aizen, he said, nth. E-name did the thing names sometimes do when they fit the man wearing them. It sat exactly right on the bones. Tamari didn't move her fan. Called by whom? Aizen considered the question as if she had offered him a puzzle box he could open with one more breath. Once by brothers, he said. Now by the thing that hears bells. Karen's eyebrows did a good jump at that. Terrific, she muttered. A poet. Hinata stepped forward the fraction that keeps the wind from stealing the next word. You watched, she said. I measured, Aizen agreed, without apology. His gaze slid to Naruto's face. You turned away from easy erasure. Naruto shrugged. People are bad to erase. They have habits, and those habits touch too many other habits. It'd be messy. I don't like messy unless it's earned. Aizen's mouth made a line that might have been a smile if he'd ever practiced those. And if the world itself threatens to erase you, then I pick a different world, Naruto said, and grinned because it sounded dead absurd, and he loved absurd things that were also true. One where people are allowed to breathe. Aizen took that in and set it down somewhere that would be hard to find later. There is a sky opening, he said. An inversion. It is not cruel. It is not kind. It is rest mistaken for mercy. His eyes softened the smallest fraction. You are not invited. We don't sit out invitations we don't like, Tamari said politely. Aizen bowed the barest amount, then straightened, exactly the kind of man who would warn you once because he respected the way you stood. Be careful where you put your breath, he said to Naruto. Some doors only open one way. He stepped back, 1 foot into the notch his body had made in the night. I hope to meet you again, he added, and the word, hope, wasn't poetry or threat, it was just what it was. He became still, not the dead still of a thing finished. The exact still of a bell waiting for the hammer. He was gone. The desert breathed in again. The insects remembered their arguments. A wind wandered by and made the bell's rope nudge the bronze without sound. Karen blew out a breath. I was going to call him a condescending monk, she said, but he didn't condescend. I hate nuanced opposition. Temari's fan closed with a whisper. Ministry in the morning, she said. And after that, skies that forget their own manners. Hinata slid her fingers through Naruto's. Quick as an old habit and anonymous as prayer. He squeezed back, also anonymous. The night didn't judge. They turned toward the road that would wander, briefly, along the monastery border. The desert kept pace, its receipts in perfect order, its forgiveness on layaway. Above them, the stars clocked their appointed routines without complaint. Naruto didn't look back at the bell. He had already heard it. And it had heard him, and somewhere far ahead a piece of sky was practicing being a door that didn't need hinges. He grinned toward it, unafraid, because fear was useful in ALS. Oh, because he had friends who kept the wind honest. Let's go break a law, he said cheerfully, and Tamari snorted despite herself. Fine, she said, but we write a better one to replace it. I can't stand an ugly statute. Deal, Naruto said, and the desert, pleased by their manners, granted them a breeze that smelled briefly like rain. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. The Shrine Where Futures Bleed. The mountain didn't bother with a welcome. It rose like a white knuckle out of cloud, ribs of stone banded with old ice, the air thinning to the kind of quiet that made speech an intrusion. The path was a stairway cut straight into bone. It had no rails. It did not trust hands. Naruto liked it on sight. They climbed in a line because the stair was mean and because people who had learned to survive understood that single file wasn't just about fitting. Hinata first, light and exact, her breath steady, her eyes counting the pockets of air where the wind cooled. Naruto next, because he could lift if someone slipped and because the mountain felt like a person who respected being met head-on. Karen grumbled in third, because grumbling kept her warm, and because her seal bag thumped against her high P like a heart that had misread its own urgency. Temari brought up the rear, fan strapped tight, a strip of cloth over her mouth to keep the cold from having opinions about her lungs. Halfway up, a B.LL sounded from somewhere above the cloud line, once, deep, the note somersaulting in their bones. It wasn't the waystation's bell, not clean bronze. This was older, a throat singing through wood. Karen paused just long enough to mutter around her scarf, "Do they sell those in different levels of foreboding?" "Shien's shrine uses one," Hinata said softly. "To call attention. Mine usually slaps," Temari said dryly. "I suppose sound works too." They rounded the last turn and the shrine showed itself. A brush stroke of white buildings clinging to a ledge, roofs black against the pale sky, prayer flags frisking like disobedient children in a wind that disapproved of them. A stair of white stone rose the last 20 feet into cloud. A woman stood at the top barefoot, the hem of her priestess, robes damp, hair unbound. Her gaze was far away and right there, like she was reading a line of scripture someone had written across Naruto's collarbone. "Shien," Hinata said, and bowed. The woman's UTH warmed for Hinata the way people's mouths do when a kindness they remember walks into the room. "Welcome," Shien said. "One of you will die here if you insist on being only one thing." Karen blew a breath out between her teeth. "Wonderful," she said. "Immediate, bracing, vague." Shien's eyes slid to Karen with the affection you sometimes give a friend who pretends a sharp tongue is armor. "You were born counting. Your heart will choose subtraction if you do not give it better work." Temari's fan made a small sound as it shifted against its straps. "Do you talk like that to everyone?" she asked. "Or is this a special missionary mode?" Shien's mouth did that almost smile again. "My bell only rings when someone lies to themselves," she said. "You should be safe." They let that settle. Naruto didn't ask about the death. Prophecy in the true sense wasn't a story about later, it was a price tag someone had stuck on now. He gazed past Shien at the open shrine doors, at the shadow of Summit. Hing curved and tall inside. A bell tower, maybe, and then back at the priestess. "We're walking into something," he said. "We always are," Shien said, and her eyes warmed a fraction more for him because he had given her an answer that acknowledged shared work. "But yes, the shrine has woken a labyrinth to test what you hold. It's not cruel, it is efficient." Karen sighed. "Do you have a pamphlet?" "Rules. Tour guide. Show us the door," Naruto said, not unkindly, because if there were rules they'd learn them by banging their heads against them, and if there weren't, Shien would only make his bag heavier with metaphors. Shien led them under a lintel painted with a single perfect spiral. Inside, the air smelled of wood and frost and something greener, cut herbs hanging to dry under rafters. The inner courtyard was square around a circle, a well, its lip worn smooth by palms that had asked questions and gotten the kind of answers that require all your fingers to hold. "The labyrinth is 3 tests, Shien said. "Or 1 test done 3 ways. You'll see." "I hate that sentence," Karen said, but soft, because the quiet here asked you to hate things politely. Shien rang a small bell. It made a noise that didn't go out into the air so much as down through your ribs. The well's water darkened. The courtyard's shadows rolled toward it like breath being drawn. The far wall blurred the way road does in heat. Then the wall wasn't the wall anymore, and there was a corridor, and beyond it a room that had opinions about geometry. Temari glanced at Naruto. "You're kind of trouble," she said. "It moves." He grinned. "That means we can move it back." He stepped forward and did the only decent she knew how to do in new places. He touched the air before he asked it to hold him. The corridor did not collapse. The room at the end waited. The first room was mirrors. Not glass. The shrine wasn't petty. These were polished obsidian slabs that held images only when you weren't looking directly at them. Naruto caught a flash of orange jacket and laughed at himself, childhood's habit sneaking past discipline. Then the room clicked into focus, and the mirrors became doors that only opened when you hated the version of yourself on the other side. Hinata walked into the center before Naruto could try to shoulder the whole thing. Her shoulders were relaxed, her hands loose. The mirrors noticed her. They showed him too many ways to fail her. Him running one way and her running another, his breath working like a saw as he chewed at an enemy's edge while behind him the person he loved most stumbled alone into something that wanted to erase her. He knew those images. You never climb out of some gutters in your mind. You plant flowers around them and learn to step between. Hinata stopped in front of a slab that offered the neatest cruelty. Naruto looking back over his shoulder at her, mouth open to start a sentence about how she would understand. The kind of sentence good people use to justify a cut. Hinata's throat worked once. She didn't reach for him. She reached for the mirror and rested her fingers on it the way she had rested them on his jaw on the cliff, like the touch could remind the world how to behave. Go, she said, and it wasn't a test. She meant it. The mirror didn't tolerate sincere consent. It shivered, offended by the lack of drama, and turned to dust that fell toward the floor and became nothing before it landed. The others went with it, one by one, cheap illusions embarrassed by someone who refused to make them grand. Karen made a quiet, appreciative noise. Quote, "I will break out in hives if the next room isn't rude," she said. That was almost too elegant. It obliged her. The second room had walls scrawled in numbers, endless columns of them, crawling like ants. Digits replacing digits in a pattern that didn't repeat so much as confess it had a private myth. Karen stepped into it and the numbers turned their little obsidian faces toward her like sunflowers. She laughed, sharp and delighted. Ah, names. Naruto squinted. It's numbers. It's both, Karen said. Everything is both if you're stubborn. These are being counts, not chakra, not mass. How much a person is, in the old sense. How their name weighs. Temari's gaze flipped through the room like a fan opening and closing. And what is the consequence if the numbers don't like you? Karen's grin became teeth. They eat the part of you that keeps your name attached. That's why it feels like ants. They nibble. You've done this before, Naruto asked. Karen's eyes didn't leave the wall. Wake up, Naruto. All ceiling is naming. Uzumaki are librarians who got bored with shelves. She wiped her palms on her thighs and then, without ceremony, cut the heel of one hand on a nicked tile. Blood beaded and ran. She smeared it over the nearest column. The numbers blazed briefly a bright childhood blue and then scrambled away, horrified by touch. Do you need? Hinata started. I need to be bait, Karen said. Numbers love a pattern that bleeds. This is a room that wants to decide reality without being interrupted by someone's pulse. Hate that. She moved with quick, angry grace, dragging her bloody heel along the walls. Writing spirals inside spirals, ruining the algorithm with herself. Ink crawled out of her seal bag unbidden and tried to marry the blood. She slapped it, affectionate. Later. We're already dating. Naruto was already moving with her, fingers grazing the air above her patterns, not to make them stronger, just to make sure the room remembered that, thin, could keep its shape. He didn't overdo the breath. He put down little, neat stitches where the wall tried to bulge and swallow her whole. Temari didn't touch the numbers. She watched Karen the way a fencing mast watches someone who fights with a chair. Left, she said once, and Karen ducked before the column's digits could bite at her eyes. Hinata followed the flow with a doctor's heart. Your pulse, she murmured. And Karen adjusted it. Literally adjusted it. Breath in, breath out, the beat falling into a rhythm that brought the scrawled values down where her messy fingerprints had told them to go. T-H-E-Y reached the far arch with their names scuffed but not spilled. Karen braced a bloody palm against the stone and breathed out carefully, like a woman who had just finished a good argument and found she could still laugh. Shion. She called back cheerfully, your house is terrible. Shion stood in the corridor behind them, the bell quiet in her hand. It's made of choices, she said. Terrible is one of the choices. The third room tried to be a council chamber. Tamari slowed. She didn't speak because of course she wouldn't. This was her church, and it would be wrong to pray there in front of witnesses. The room had benches, arranged just so, and a long table where voices could be organized into neat columns. People who had never needed to lift anything heavier than their own opinions would have been very happy here. Tamari took her seat, and it wasn't surrender, it was entry. Figures resolved around the table. Not people but the idea of people, boiled down to things Tamari didn't respect. Empty authority, old money. Clever cruelty. They began to tell her how her life was correctly spent. She let them talk for a count of 10 because she appreciated a good script. Then she began to interrupt. Not with speeches. Tamari thought speeches were what you did when you were covering for a weak plan, but with outcomes. That policy saves 3 now, she said to the shadow in the robe, and kills 30 later because the border town will not have enough water. You didn't factor how many little girls steal extra buckets. To the merchant, you will sell steel twice and pretend your second price is fair. I'll put a wind tax on your caravans until you remember shame. The wind and I talk. The shadows tried to make their voices heavy. Tamari's went light and cut. My friends get the same respect as my treaties, she said. And when the council tried to laugh, she held up a hand. No, you don't get to make a joke out of what keeps people alive. We all washed our hands this morning and put on our smart faces. Now we'll behave like it. A chair scraped. The precise sound of a man making a point without being rude about it. The shadow at the end of the table leaned forward and tried to show Tamari the line between a village full of strangers and the women standing behind her here. It suggested that one could be let go in favor of the other. It offered her the softest kind of coward. Ice. Personal loyalty is an excuse for neglect. Do you think I haven't looked at the scale? Tamari asked, tired suddenly and angrier because it was the good kind of tired. Do you think my fan is pretty because it is a fan? Do you understand what a wind does to a fire when you teach it better manners? She stood and the bench accepted the fact of that. I am the woman who lists the receipts. I'm the woman who cleans up. I do not choose lesser fires. I choose fire breaks. The council tried to turn into a mob because mobs are easier to steer. Tamari's fan snicked open, the smallest sound, and WIND moved through the room the way a story moves through a crowd when it is told by the person who was there. The benches grumbled their way back into a straight line. The long table admitted it had never been natural. The room said yes to her and then vanished. Naruto found himself laughing, proud in a way that traveled like good heat. I don't want to arm wrestle you, he said. Tamari tilted her head, pleased but unwilling to make a fuss. You'd lose, she said, and returned the fan to her shoulder like a hunter sheathing a blade. Xian was waiting at the last threshold with her bell and something else in her eyes, worry, maybe. But the kind that smiles for company. She bowed, not deep, just enough to be precise. The 3 doors, she said, are only doors if you insist on thinking of them that way. You opened them by being the persons you were when you stopped narrating yourselves. Is there a gift shop? Karen asked. Xian laughed, sudden and bright, as if someone had cut the right chord on a kite. Outside, she said. First we have a guest. The guest was already in the courtyard. He stood with one hand resting on the well, the other relaxed at his side. Aizen wore the same simple robes. And this time Naruto decided if he looked handsome or plain wasn't the question, he looked right, which is harder. His presence did that subtle, awful thing to air again where it became correct. In a way that made the edges of other things blur. He wasn't making the courtyard still. He was reminding it of stillness as if it had been lazy. Tamari didn't open her fan. She set it down against the well lip within reach, which said several things at once. Karen took 3 steps left so that if something went sideways, her lines would already be halfway to being drawn. Hinata's eyes were white and gentle, which always meant she was paying attention to too many things and would still hear the smallest needs. Aizen inclined his head to Xian, not quite as low as to Naruto because their debt was different. Priestess, he said. Bell, Xian replied, which was a rude and light and correct way to answer someone who had been making other people's ribs vibrate for 2 nights in a row. Core. Ner of Aizen's mouth acknowledged the hit. He looked at Naruto. Your breath. How you use it. Bad habit, Naruto said cheerfully. Picking fights with things that are trying to right themselves on my friends. It is not a fight if I am teaching them to rest, Aizen said, and he didn't harden his voice. He allowed it to stay tender, which made it worse. You will run yourselves beyond repair. This world has been ringing for too long. The hammer doesn't love the bell. Naruto stepped into range of the well's quiet. He didn't invade Aizen's space. He joined it and changed the definition of space by standing there. Rest and erasure aren't the same. I like quiet. I like when my friends are alive inside it. Your friends keep you from the worst version of yourself, Aizen said. That makes them await. That makes you dangerous. Hinata didn't flinch. She folded her hands and bowed. It wasn't submission. It was an introduction. I am Hinata Hyuga, she said. I'm very fond of weights. They keep things from blowing away. Aizen watched her, genuinely considering. The ministry will try to take you alive, he said. They prefer witnesses at the end of their orders. They like to say a thing too often and call it law. He shifted his hand away from the well and the air said thank you. Allow me to measure. It wasn't a request. It wasn't threat. It was a craftsman's desire to say. What a tool did when met with a new kind of wood. Naruto breathed in and let the breath be both. Dawn and dusk, genesis and unspooling, not a show of force but a rehearsal of what he was trying to become. Aizen stepped and the space between them turned to glass without shining. Sound fell off Naruto's bones. His heartbeat went quiet in his own ears, the world dimmed its applause. Naruto tapped heel to stone. Not a stomp, a beat, then a second, then a third, an old rhythm learned in training halls that stank of sweat and chalk and patient older men. Aizen had stillness. Naruto made time. The bell in Shien's hand shivered once. Agreed, and then stayed silent because no one had lied to themselves yet. They moved like that, quiet and careful, two ideas testing their friction. Aizen stilled a thread of Naruto's cloak mid-flutter. Naruto created a whisper of wind chimes from nothing but memory and made the chimes hang in air that wanted to be glass. Aizen looked surprised. It was tiny, that look. A man finding a pebble in a smooth shoe. He adjusted. He reached past Naruto toward Hinata. Not touching, not threatening, measuring the way her flow kept Naruto's balanced. Naruto erased the relationship between Aizen's attention and Hinata's pulse, gently. He made Aizen miscount. You can't have her breath, Naruto said, and kept the amusement in his voice so it wouldn't turn into a snarl he would regret later. Good, Aizen said simply. I respect men who know what is not theirs. They broke. Not a clash, not a winner. Two schools bowing because this was enough for now. The inverted sky is opening, Aizen said after a breath. You will try to climb into it. The ministry will try to lock it shut. Both of you will be wrong. Is there a third option? Temari asked, crisp. Aizen's gaze slid to her. Write better law. Temari's eyebrows rose a fraction. Already on the agenda, she said. Karen licked blood off a knuckle where she'd reopened a cut scratching at a dried patch of ink. Are you with the ministry? She asked Aizen, deliberately making it small and crude because sometimes only a blunt question kept a room honest. No, Aizen said, but we are both in love with edges. They keep an honest shape. Shien lifted the bell and set it down beside the well. It made a little sound like a throat clearing. Naruto, she said, and her voice had picked up a quiet weight, the way a woman's voice goes when she has stopped letting herself be kind and started letting herself be useful. If you mean to write a better law, the shrine can lend you a line. She held out her hand. And something shimmered between her fingers. A circlet made of no metal, a ring of lacquered wood carved with tiny indentations that looked like nothing until they were worn. Portable. It will keep gravity honest to the degree you are honest with yourself while wearing it. Karen leaned forward, fascinated. It only rings when you lie to yourself, Shien finished, amused and sad at once. Which will make you unpopular at parties. Naruto reached for the circlet and then paused. There's a cost, he said. Of course, Shien said, eyes warm as a kitchen. The bell will ring when anyone with you lies to themselves. Not only you. Her gaze touched Hinata, Temari, Karen and returned without apology. You will hear it. Hinata's chin lifted. Good, she said in that quiet that could make men abandon wars. I would rather be held to what I am than comforted by what I am not. Tamari snorted. If it rings when I tell myself I don't like any of you, I'll throw it off a cliff. Karen held out a hand. Let me tune the carrier seal so it doesn't bite him for breathing. Shien's smile found teeth. You can try, she said, and set the circlet in Naruto's palms. It was warm. Not spiritual warm, human warm. Wood that had been held by hands for a very long time. Naruto slipped it over his wrist. It settled against his skin and made no sound. He waited. People who had been offered gifts by gods who were bad at being people learn not to thank too soon. Aizen stepped back from the well, and in the space his hand had left, cold rose. Not weather cold, the kind your body recognizes as tea. He kind of hunger you won't fill by eating. Be careful where you place your breath, he said again. Doors remember who opened them. Naruto nodded, because he had already decided to be careful and be. Aang told a thing you've already chosen makes it easier, not harder. Will we meet again? He asked, not to box the world into an answer, but because it mattered. Aizen looked up. Cloud was dragging across the mountain. The edge of it thin and rope like a horse's back when it's all ribs and speed. I hope so, he said, and there it was again, that clean, non-theatrical hope. He crossed the courtyard, rode and did not give anyone his back because it was not that kind of dance. He became the knight at the edge of the door and then there was only door. They stayed very still until the quiet loosened its corset. The bell did not ring. Shien exhaled. Food, she said. Then the last thing. They ate on the outer steps because the kitchen was a closet and because soup tastes better when the air tries to steal it. Naruto didn't realize how hungry he was until the bowl was warm in his hands and then it was a problem he had the skill to solve. Tamari blew on a spoonful and pretended not to notice when. Karen watched her mouth the way a scientist watches a jet engine. Hinata ate slowly, always, taking small, deliberate bites that made Naruto's own pace settle. Shien ate like someone who had been ting for too long without making a ceremony of it. Ministry. Tamari asked Shien between bites. Cruel by courtesy, Shien said. They ask permission for their violence before they do it and thus convince themselves they never did it at all. Regent. Karen asked. Likes banners, Shien said. Likes the idea of banners. Has never stood under one he did not stitch himself. Captain Sazanami. Hinata asked. Would polish the knife that cuts his own throat if you told him it belonged to procedure, Shien said, and there was no hate in it. He will try not to choose. That is a choice. Naruto tapped the circlet where it rode his wrist. And Nagi? He asked. Because saying the name of something big and stupid and hungry sometimes made it shrink to something you could push with your weight. Hion's eyes flicked to him with something like pride. A quiet that believes itself to be kindness, she said. It is not a person. It is a letter without a word around it trying to take over the sentence. Don't argue. Define. He nodded. They were done with soup. He set his bowl aside and stood, shoulders loosening in that way he had when he decided to carry new weight. What's the last thing? He asked. Shien took them not down into the well. The shrine was not a story that dull, but up, into the bell tower, which was a skeleton of wood wrapped around the idea of a ringing. The bell was black, and seemed to have borrowed its light from the mountain itself. When Shien touched it, it required nothing of her. She murmured and something under their feet changed. Just a slight adjustment, like a person deciding to take pain in the left ankle instead of the right for a few steps. The bell will accompany you, she said. Not the big one, a small one. She held up a new object, invisible until it made sound. A bell cupped between her hands, no bigger than a tea bowl, carved of the same impossible wood. It will ring when someone lies to themselves, she said. It will ring when someone promises themselves and breaks it. It will ring when you stand on ground that will not hold. Karen's mouth was a slash of hunger. Can it hold Nagi's quiet back? No, Shien said, pleased that someone had asked well. But it can make a noise that tells you where to build. Hinata reached for it without fear. Shien let her take it. The bell didn't ring. It warmed. A shape moved in the sky through the bell tower's ribs. Naruto didn't like it. Not because it was ugly. It was clean, and he admired clean things, but because it made his eyes argue with his body. A band of pale air stretched like a river where no river should be, horizontal, bright, and wrong. Birds skated along it, their wings making no sound, their bodies moving like notes on staff paper in some immaculate score. Xian's breath went out. There early. Temeri's eyes narrowed. Ministry. No, Xian said. Ministry will arrive on time with their pressed collars. This is Aizen's door, Hinata said softly. His gods, Xian corrected. He's only the man who holds it open as my hope. The band widened. The sky remembered being sky where it was and then decided, in a soft, terrible drift, that it had always been that band. A flock of swifts flew into it and became brushstrokes moving insincerely. The bell in Hinata's hands rang. It wasn't loud, it wasn't even sound, entirely. It was a reminder, and it made Naruto's head ache because he'd told himself a small lie without noticing, that they had longer. He felt the lie slide out of him like a splinter and the pain after was cleaner. Xian didn't say, I told you. She said, you'd better go. Where? Temari asked. Up, Xian said, which was either a joke or mercy. They spilled down the stairs and into the courtyard, where the well's water lay so flat it looked like a monk's mind in winter. Aizen was not waiting this time. The door would be open for whoever dared without him holding it. Naruto glanced at his team and tasted his own breath like the first mouthful of cold water after a run. Structure, Temari said automatically, because that was the game that kept people alive, and Naruto loved her for making the first move when the sky tried to make fear be the move. Spiral stare, Naruto said, already stamping, already sketching air with his hands the way carpenters do when they're about to lie to gravity until it believes them. It won't like plating, it will like ribs. I'll tune it, Karen said, producing tags out of everywhere, hands already shaking because she was so happy. If you commit to a rhythm I can make the math hum. Hinata lifted the bell. I will call your exact center, she said, voice steady and bright like the inside of a pearl. Xian reached for Naruto's wrist and tightened the circlet half a notch. It will ring in ways you hate, she said. Which was a gift. Let it. Air support, Naruto asked Temari. Always, Temari said. She had already climbed the wall to the outer ledge and was testing the wind with her fingers, eyes narrowed, mouth wry. I'll keep gravity remembering how it treats friends. The spiral stair jumped up from the courtyard in a clean, hopeful curve, stone ribs growing out of air like some thing the mountain had been meaning to say all these years but hadn't found the right breath. It wasn't perfect. Perfect would break. It was something better. Constantly correcting itself around people who had committed to each other. They ran. The band of wrong sky wavered and thickened ahead of them. It wasn't close by any honest measure. The world had simply decided distance was a story it didn't want to tell right now. Naruto set the pace with a discipline that would have made his teachers cry with relief. Fast, not sprinting, efficient, not brave. Hinata called small corrections. 2 degrees left, hold breath now. Rest the creation, let destruction sing for 2 steps, and he obeyed them without pride. Temeri's wind slid under the stair and propped it where a rib wanted to go thin. Karen slapped tags at every 3rd step, spun the ink lines tight, and stuttered breath on every 5th because she insisted on calibrating her pulse to the math of humming. The bell in Hinata's hands did not ring for fear. It rang when Naruto tried to be 2 things at once. Too much dawn in his chest, too much dusk in his mouth, and he hated it in a way that told him he would be arguing with it for as long as it was with them and that the argument would keep them alive. They reached the edge. In front of them the band wasn't a band, it was a lake suspended in air, perfectly horizontal until you looked too long. And then your eyes admitted that the horizon had cracked and gone crooked. The lake lapped at nothing. It had waves that rolled sideways with polite sound. It was not water. It was the place where the world had drawn a long breath and forgotten to let it out. Something moved within it. Not Nagi. Not a person. A law, practicing. At least it's trying to be gracious, Temari said. I hate graceless apocalypse. Karen yelled something unrepeatable at the sky because she treated new physics the way she treated arrogant men, with laughter that sounded like a dare. Hinata lifted the bell and it stayed quiet. No lies here, she said softly. Only habit. Then let's write a new one, Naruto said, and stepped forward like he was making a joke with someone he loved. The stair kissed the bee, and should have slipped like a knife sliding off glass. It didn't, because Naruto erased the relationship between that contact and the part of gravity that remembered down only as a suggestion. He did not erase falling. He loved falling. He erased falling without being caught, because he had decided that was a bad law. The band accepted the stairs foot as if this had always been how stairs worked. A breath of cold rolled out. The hair on Naruto's arms lifted. The bell did not ring. Temari's wind found a bite and held it. Karen's tags brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again as they remembered their own humility. Hinata called cadence. 5 steps, stop, 3 breaths, 7 steps, left, duck, eyes closed, 2 heartbeats. They moved the way people do when they've accepted that here's no such thing as this happening, there is only, are you ready to make it happen better? A crack chased itself across the sky like a line drawn by a careful, unstoppable child. Under it, he desert rolled over onto its back in the near distance. Birds wheeled, confused, then traced figures 8 along a plane they had not been invited to use but could not refuse. Somewhere far below, he ocean stood up and took a step toward the moon and then decided against it, embarrassed. The stair shook once, chiding. Naruto made the next rib shorter and the next longer to balance. Temari breathed out and the wind listened. The bell rang a single, small, furious note. Who lied? Karen demanded, breathless. I told myself I wasn't afraid, Hinata said simply, and didn't slow. I am. It's fine. Naruto bit back a grin. He couldn't help it. He loved her like he loved letting gravity keep its dignity. They cleared the lip and stood inside the inverted sky. Everything was the wrong orientation except their bodies and their choices. Colors dulled the way colors do in winter when you haven't eaten enough fruit. Sound was perfect and thus untrustworthy. In the near distance, something like a cliff hung below them. And on it someone had planted banners, not Astra but cousins, Izans, maybe, poles with streamers that didn't move because motion was impolite here. Field fortification, Temari said, and her eyes went bright because she loved honest fights dressed up as puzzles. I'll take the left. She jerked her chin at Naruto, don't be clever alone. Never, he said, and meant it. They were still setting their feet when a clear voice carried up from the banners below, shaped by someone who valued enunciation over volume. It had always been pleasant. It made ugly things sound tidy. Uzumaki, Regent Hashira called, as if welcoming a guest to his garden. Thank you for meeting us on an even plane. Temari sighed into her scarf. He made a pun in an apocalypse. Karen cupped her mouth and shouted down. You're losing cadence, Hashira. Your second banner is arguing with your fourth. Hashira did not take the bait. His gaze slid past them to the stair touching the band of sky like a very polite error. We'll be taking your interesting walkway, he said to Naruto. It's safer for everyone if your new toy is put away. Naruto wiped his palm on his cloak, fingers buzzing with the wrong cold that lived here. I'll take it down when my people are done with it, he said easily. Hashira's smile was neat. Of course, he said, like they were partners. He raised a hand. The knot wind folded around the banners as if remembering marching orders. On your bell, Shien's voice floated from below and behind them. She had followed farther than anyone expected a priestess to. The small bell in Hinata's hands went quiet at the sound of her voice, as if reassured. And then there were more boots on the stair behind them. Naruto turned and met the gaze of a woman with pale hair and an expression like perfectly folded laundry. Neat, efficient, a faint judgment on anyone who'd gotten creases wrong. Kumo blues peeked from under travel gear, a short sword hung at her hip in a plain sheath that made no claims and would do exactly what it promised. Samui, she said, not bothering with a bow, because balance was tenuous and she wasn't going to throw it off for etiquette. Yumo sent me to verify rumors and check which way the world is tilting. I see it's mostly up. Samui, Temari echoed, dry. You people keep showing up at interesting times. Samui's eyes flicked across the stair, the bell, the tags. The wrong sky, she filed, assessed, decided. I can keep your steps from unscrewing themselves. She drew the short sword and it wasn't a sword now, it was a maintenance tool. She knelt. slid the point under a seam in one of Karen's tags where it had begun to blister in the wrong cold, and lifted. The blister sighed and lay flat. "Don't ask me for a speech. I do inventory." Karen loved her immediately in the way that made her mouth cruel and her hands kind. "Don't mess my lines." "Wouldn't dream of it," Samui said, and then murmured to the blade in a way that wasn't poetry at all. Angles and torque and someone who had taken apart too many things that weren't supposed to be taken apart. The next step stopped making that worrying tiny squeal. "Welcome to the truly worst version of stairs," Naruto said, bright with relief, because her presence made the pattern of the day feel like it had been waiting for exactly this piece. Samui said, "Please don't fall. Paperwork is hell when bodies are involved." The banners below flexed in a way that suggested Hashira had stopped admiring the architecture and started executing the part of his plan labeled, "Politely corner them." Aizen didn't appear, which meant he was watching, which meant all the rules would tighten the second someone tried to cheat too loudly. "Structure," Tamari repeated. "Left flank. Samui, keep the screws honest. Karen, make him a spine. Hinata, call truth. Naruto, don't hero the pincer," he said, grinning despite the wrong cold gnawing his lashes. "Make a machine that wants to travel." He breathed. Dawn, dusk, both, balanced, and the bell was quiet. The stair grew a second curve, upswept, leafing into the inverted sky like a plant that had decided air made pretty soil. He built not a wall but a purse, the kind you tighten when a thief reaches in. He drew the plane around the banners into a bias that would make their volleys arrive charmingly late. Hashira saw the shape of the trick, because of course he did. And altered cadence. The neatness in his voice frayed for a syllable. "Containment volley," he called. Hinata breathed. "Now," she told Naruto, at the exact sill. Label where dawn and dusk in his chest would balance if he trusted her. And he did, and his breath became a law that wasn't a law because laws are arrogant. It was a reminder. Falling things will want to be caught. The world didn't like being told what to want. It accepted it because Hinata had called the beat. The volley hit a space that decided to be lenient for 1 second. In a fight, a second is a kind of immortality. Samui's blade flicked at a seam. "Loose," she murmured, and the seam stopped pretending it wasn't. Karen's tags sang the smug song of systems that believe in their architect. "You're welcome," she muttered, too pleased to pretend indifference. Temari's wind argued with the wrong air and won 3 hairs, worth of room for everyone to breathe, which in a place like this was the difference between writing and erasing. The inverted sky didn't crack. It tilted. The bell rang once in pure warning. Hinata's head snapped toward the far edge where the band ran thin. "It's going to swallow the desert inlet," she said, the place where 1,000 small villages traded their water-like secrets and lived accordingly. "If it erases the motion there." "Famine," Tamari finished, not because she was fatalistic but because you cannot write a better law if you do not write the bad one first. Naruto felt something ugly and useful surge in his chest. He could unmake the habit of the inverted sky swallowing that inlet with the same facility with which he unmade Rope's affection for axles. He could tear the idea out of this place and throw it where the sun couldn't find it. The bell rang softly, reproving. Not for the desire, for the lie he was telling himself about the cost. He breathed out, ungilding his own impulse. "Okay," he said, to the bell and to himself and to the Ron. G-Sky trying to pass itself off as mercy. Not by force. By what, then? Karen asked, impatient because speed and goodness were not mutually exclusive in her theology. By definition, Naruto said, and felt Aizen's attention snag on that word like a loose thread on a nail. He lifted his hands the way he did when he told a story to children who had never liked sitting still. He made a small law, not because small laws are easier, but because they are less arrogant. Words spoken in good faith will carry farther. He made another. Falling things will want to be caught by hands that are trying. The inverted sky did not applaud. The band did not bow. But somewhere below, along the desert inlet, a woman's shout for help carried 1 courtyard farther than it would have, and the man who heard it found he had time to finish tying his boat and still jumped to save a child who had been too bold with a bucket. Tamari shot him a sideways look that could have been devotion if it had been worse. "Woman. Ugly statutes give me hives," she said. "Yours itch less." Hashira, Far below, realized he was losing something he didn't have a name for. He adjusted again. Clean, relentless. He would eventually SC. Or a point by erasing one of Naruto's ribs in a way that would cost them pain later. That was fine. Pain was always scheduled. And somewhere to the right, where the band was thinnest, a stillness COI. Led like a god who had been invited to a small party and had found the hors d'oeuvres acceptable. It stretched. It considered manners. It reached for the stair. Brace, Samui said calmly. Hinata lifted the bell. It stayed silent. No lies. Then, just the thing itself. Naruto breathed and set both hands to the ribs of the stair, anchoring where wood met stone met definition. Temari's wind got under the wrong sky and made it puff its cheeks. Karen's tags dug their little ink heels in and refused to move unless paid. Samui's blade found 3 more blisters and lifted each with a sigh. The stillness touched the stair. For one heartbeat everything forgot to move again. Naruto's breath came back first, because he was rude that way, and in that first heartbeat he made a last small law, as quiet a nd unassuming as a prayer in a back pew. If someone reaches to be caught, that reaching counts as motion. He felt the world resist and then fail at being stubborn. The reaching counted. The stair didn't die. It moved as if someone had held out their hands. The inverted sky hummed a sound that might have been offense and might have been interest. Below, Hashira lowered his hand, recalculating. Somewhere between them, Aizen exhaled in a way that sounded like someone who had noticed a solution he hadn't permitted himself to propose. The band brightened one shade toward honest. The crack in the horizon softened as if somebody had rubbed it with a thumb. It wasn't victory. It was angle. It was enough. Okay, Naruto said through his teeth, grinning like a man running downhill who has remembered he can steer. Let's make this a short sky. Behind him the bell sat warm on Hinata's palm, quiet, vigilant, ready to accuse the next small kindness of being a lie only if it had to. Temari's fan Y. Ted for the moment where a law needed a little wind behind it. Karen's next tag stuck to the rib like affection. Samui flicked her sword and an invisible screw turned a quarter in the right direction. Far below, the ocean did one audacious, wrong thing, climbed itself into a suggestion of a standing wave, and then, embarrassed by its own bravado, lay down again. Shien's voice floated up through air that had no right to be a messenger. Write better, she said, almost laughing and nearly crying. Naruto took another step into a sky that had been learning how to say no and offered it a way to say why. That didn't require it to become a liar. The world held. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. When the sky turned upside down. The plan lived first in chalk. They drew on rock because rock remembered without arguing. 4 hands worked together on the cliff shelf above the land of iron's birch-stitched valleys. Temari's fine angles and margins, Samui's terse ticks at load-bearing seams, Karen's spirals and rabbed notes that read like curses but meant, do this, not that. Hinata's neat arrows, each placed where the world's flows would consent. Naruto held the chalk last, not because he needed to bless it, but because it steadied him to see everyone else's lines first. He signed the bottom with a quick spiral and a grin. The spiral wasn't a flourish. It meant we go together. Above them, the sky had a seam that hadn't been there 2 nights ago. It ran like a river where there was no river, pale and horizontal, its edge so clean it insulted the mountains. The locals had started calling it the Mirror Lake because they needed a name. But up close it was more like a second sky lying belly down on the first. An extra, rude firmament that reflected nothing, listened to nothing, and called its silence mercy. Below the cliff, the coalition gathered in strokes of color and steel. Sand cloaks from Suna, storm-stitched blues from Kumo, a handful of Konoha-jonin in green vests that had been patched more times than a favorite story. Mist shinobi stood in a small, quiet knot, their gear sharp as their glances. A rain country captain with a grave face was buckling nullsteel counterbands to his unit's AR. Ms. with the slow care of a father putting on a child's shoes. No speeches. There'd been too many of those in other wars. People moved. The chalk dried. The chalk meant a thing. Crosswind gusts will roll in off the west ridge, Temari said. Knuckles tapping the cliff as if it were a drum that kept weather time. Expect 3 a minute. I'll take the first 2, you take the third. She tipped her ch. in toward Naruto as if this had been agreed on 30 years ago. Third's always the rude one, Naruto said, cheerful because he didn't know how to be any other way with people he trusted. He looked to Hinata. She had Shien's small bell cupped in one palm, the wood polished by 100 years of thoughtful hands and now by hers. The bell's quiet, she said. She didn't add, for now. It was baked into the way she held her shoulders even and her heart steady under the cold. Karen slapped a folded map onto his chest. I tuned the tag matrix to your stare's heartbeat, she said, eyes flashing behind her lenses. If you start improvising into poetry mid-climb, I will fall on you out of spite. Promise, Naruto said, because flirting with Karen was like crossing blades with a friend who sharpened both your knives. Samui squinted up at the seam in the sky, a hand shading her eyes, the other absently checking the fit on her short sword's hilt. I'll be under the steps, she said in her even, unconcerned way. If something starts unscrewing, I'll unscrew it back. Try not to unscrew gravity, Tamari said, dry. Samui blinked, thinking it over. Noted. Shien stood just behind them, hood down. Hair in a simple knot that said she had not slept and had no time to apologize for it. The circlet she'd given Naruto rested warm against his wrist. It had not rung. It would. He loved it a little for that. The inverted sky is drift. Shien said softly, not as a warning but as a description, the way a physician tells a child which bone is cracked and which is bruised. It takes the shape of the most persistent idea in the room. Make sure you are that idea. Don't let the bureaucrats name the party, is what I'm hearing, Karen said. Shien's mouth curved. Exactly. They climbed. The firs. T-length of the stair had been born yesterday and was already smarter today. They'd learned its stubborn places and smoothed them. Ribs arced out of air like the piano of a long thin animal. Naruto id stone with his breath like a mason without masonry, no slabs, just vertebrae that carried weight because they believed in being bones. Temari's wind slid under the ribs where the ridge gusts tried to brag. Karen's tags clung to the steps with the ugly, perfect aesthetic of stitches in a wound that would scar beautifully if you didn't pick at it. Hinata called cadence with small, precise words, hold, now. 2 more, that set the rhythm of the climb more surely than any drum. Samui moved beneath, sword tip lifting seams that wanted to blister, point nudging where air started to think it was glass and forgot to be kind. They reached the band. It took them, this time, without making a point about consent. Naruto touched the seam with the ball of his foot. He erased the old habit of fall and be punished, and replaced it with fall and be caught, a law small enough to pass as courtesy. The inverted sky accepted him as if to say, if you insist on manners. They stepped up into the second world. From above, the land of iron's valleys braided into silver threads where snowmelt ran, for now. Along the ridge, a fortress grew out of the wrong sky itself, banners like spears stuck into an invisible plateau. Their cords hanging obediently, their cloths motionless. The banners were Astra cousins, stiffer and more doctrinal. They drank convention out of the air by breathing in and refusing to exhale. Regent Hashira stood nearby in lacquered black that had nothing to do with vanity and everything to do with being precise. His face was handsome in the way a seal on a proclamation is handsome. Captain Sazanami waited one step behind him, hands in the pockets of his tidy raincoat like he had grown them there. Hashira offered a soldier's bow without warmth. Uzumaki, he said, voice carrying with that unshout of his. Thank you for choosing the field that makes our work clean. Naruto smiled like they were trading recipes. I like clean, he said. I don't like erasing people to get there. Hashira's mouth quirked as if someone had told him a child had drawn a very good horse. We'll disagree about where erasure begins. He lifted 2 fingers. The banners, ribs flared. The whirl, D around Naruto turned to the texture of paper. He reached to lay another stair rib and his breath slid off the idea. Creation didn't simply refuse, it unexisted, a polite bureaucrat informing him his form was filed in the wrong building. A tag in Karen's hand sizzled in offense and went dull. Trap, Tamari snapped. Not surprise, disdain. Creation becomes stillness the second you declare it. He's made your, yes, bleed into, no. Naruto laughed because it was funny in the way a well-made ambush is admiration's cousin. He let the dawn breath sit down in his chest and lifted the other one, the dusk breath that unstitched relationships without malice. He didn't try to unmake the banners. He didn't rip anything. He slid a finger under the tiny habit that kept the banners, bases convinced they belonged to this plane of wrong sky. Erase the binding between banner and band. Not the banner. Not the band. The belonging. Metal stuttered. 3 bases skated half an inch as if embarrassed, then a full inch because embarrassment is a slippery thing. Temeri's wind kissed them and they slid further, no longer meaningfully attached to the plateau they were meant to govern. Karen whooped like a woman seeing her favorite equation hum. Yes, 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 keep doing exactly that. The first clash happened as tidily as a drill, a wedge of nullsteel troopers stepping onto the stair without hurry, then speeding up their feet like the ground asked nicely. Sazanami's hand twitched. A conductor's cue, and the wedge split, flowing around a rib. Hinata's call shaped the next 3 breaths. Step back, she murmured. And Naruto let the stair retreat like a person realizing they were in the way and pleased to move. Now, her palm pressed his spine lightly and he cut the drag under a unit of allied shin. Obi at the exact moment they needed to slide under a volley, turning their scramble into a clean downhill glide. Temeri's fan cracked once. The sound sliced the gangway of wrong air leading to Hashira's leftmost banner into polite ribbons. Try to be graceful, she suggested to gravity, and gravity listened enough to tilt. Samui appeared at Naruto's left knee and stabbed her sword tip under a seam that had begun to crust over with polite frost. This step is lying about whether it will hold, she said conversationally. It won't. Now it will. The coalition poured up behind, not in a doomed wall, but in the deliberate jagged drips of people who understood that patience kills just as surely as courage saves. Kumo's Darui, hair a lazy river made of lightning, planted a foot and made the wrong air spark as if bored. A mist hunter in dark lacquer slid in sideways and smiled softly at a nullsteel blade, then put it somewhere it didn't intend to go. The Rain Country captain, Kaneto, directed his unit with 2 fingers and a chin. Eyes skimming for civilians, because even in a sky that had forgotten how to be hospitable he kept that habit. Hashira watched an altered cadence. The banners, ribs inverted. They stopped stealing creation and began stealing change. Naruto tried to adjust the angle of a rib and the rib simply insisted it had always been as it was. Not refusal, revision. You're a historian now, Naruto called down. Careful. Those are always liars. Hashira's laugh was an exhaled punctuation mark. Spoken like a man who believes in breath too much. The world around them clicked tighter. Aizen arrived without ceremony. He stepped out of a place where the sky had forgotten to be public and into their field of view, robes moving like the weather inside a quiet room. Somethi, vast and absent coiled around him. The dragon of stillness didn't show itself with scales or teeth. It showed itself in how a flagstone forgot it had a chip, in how sound drew its own outline and stayed inside it. He lifted one hand toward the distance where a mountain stream fell into the valley. The stream went from silver lace to a glass rod to an idea. It didn't freeze. It simply became its own photograph. Naruto created wind chimes out of memory, not the strings or the bamboo, just the chiminess, and hung them in air that had been carefully trained not to carry music. The first tone was a scrape and an apology. The second found purchase on Hinata's breath. The third turned into a child's laugh, something Naruto knew from 70 different festivals, and the fourth nested in Temeri's. Whined like the shimmer you get when paper is cut with a sharp knife in a quiet room. Aizen's eyes changed 5 millimeters at most. Surprise, acknowledged. He lowered his hand and the stream stayed wrong because stillness is proud. He looked almost relieved to be resisted. It made him honest for a breath. Your law-making is rude, he said. Better than obedient, Naruto said. Below, Captain Saza, Nami stepped into a clearer patch of wrong air, looking for Naruto the way men look for people they dislike liking. He turned his head so the light found the gray at his temple and his neatness got a little older. Uzumaki, he called, do not make me choose between procedure and something I respect. Choose, then, Naruto said. Choose and be a person. The first person died then. It wasn't the first death in the world, or in this battle, but it was the one Naruto would replay when sleep left him a long cliff to fall off. Kaneto, Rain Country, whose hands moved like the hands of someone who Had 5 children and a garden with stones he had placed himself. A nullsteel soldier, young, quiet, not cruel, came at him at the wrong angle. Naruto could have erased the soldier. He had erased worse, easier things. The friction under boots, the echo between cannons, the loyalty a banner had for the wrong sky. He didn't. He cut the relationship between blade and its target. He cut the history of the thrust out of the air. It wasn't enough. The edge found a place it didn't deserve and drew a line where there should not have been one. Kaneko made a noise of surprise, not pain. He went to his knees in a way that tried to be decent. He looked up at Naruto and did not accuse him. That was worse. Temari's wind killed the follow-up cleanly, invisible, precise, and did not pretend it was anything else. Hinata was already there. She pressed her hands to Kaneko's side with a composure that refused time the dignity of running. "Stay," she said. "Breathe." He did, obediently. It would not be for long. He knew it and she knew it, and her hands were warm and certain because she wouldn't make the last breath a liar by pretending. Naruto went very still. Karen's hand closed around his wrist so hard he bell should have rung for how much she lied to herself in that grip. That you can fix every line, idiot, and didn't because Shien's bell had compassion for things it had seen too many times. "Don't you dare," Karen hissed. "Don't you dare break your rule now to pay for not breaking it earlier." He swallowed. The breath in him that loved to unmake hissed. He let it lean against his ribs and shook his head once like a man walking past a bar when he's decided to drink tea. "We don't erase people," he said. Even here, no one absolved him. Not Hinata, hands red now in a way that never becomes a color you can wash off. Not Temari, whose gaze moved back to the banners like a responsible person's anger. Not Samui, who muttered about a misthreaded seam and made that seam behave while someone bled 2 steps away. They didn't absolve him. They stayed. Aizen watched Naruto choose and file that choice somewhere that would cost him later. He didn't smile. "I know that rule," he said. "I made it too, once." Hashira saw the fissure in their cohesion and drove a wedge-shaped like policy through it. The banners, cousins flared. The wrong air around the stair became revisionist again. Creation tried to oblige the new narrative. When Naruto set a toe down to lay a new rib, it turned politely into silence and remained there as if it had always been quiet. "Pivot," Temari said. "Make a machine that runs on subtraction." Naruto did. He erased the habit terror had of living in the lower lungs of the shinobi behind him. He erased the memory of a particular stumble from the step under Samui's hand. He erased the loyalty between 2 banner pylons so they couldn't comfort each other with their rhythm. Everywhere the dusk breath moved, the stillness lost friction. Not the kind feet need, the kind fear needs to hold on. The coalition felt it like a rope going tight between friends. They moved the way you move when someone who knows what they are doing tells you the floor is going to stay the floor. Kumo split left with a lightning grin to worry a flank. Suna's riders slid along the edge of wrong air and pinned a banner with 3 ropes and 2 insults. Mist's quiet killers cut the neat GHT angles of the ministry into obliging curves. Sazanami recited Naruto across the world's tilted dinner table and ordered something he did not want to order. Naruto could see it in his jaw, a man telling the world, tidy up, when he already knew the blood wouldn't come out. Nullsteel cannon, no roar, no heat, just a correction, an absence given shape and thrown across a room. Left, Hinata called. Low, Naruto erased the curl of want between the correction and their bodies. It slithered past, confused, as if it had been told it was late to a meeting and stopped to check the schedule. Karen's leyline caught the corner of it and nipped the impulse. Temari's wind gave it a cushion to fall on and it went thump into a blameless piece of wrong sky that had no idea how to be a wall. Samui lifted something invisible with her blade and it made a sound like a screw being persuaded not to strip. Cannon's mounting bracket is lying about its angle, she observed. Hashira's people are better at maintenance than I like. Flatter me later, Temari said. The wrong sky made a new decision. It tilted, subtle at first, then with conviction. Far below, the snowmelt on the slope of a high valley It's something topologists would get into fistfights about. Half of it climbed uphill like a well-trained dog, half didn't. On the ridge, a line of birches turned their leaves the same way in a small, civil panic. The stair groaned. Naruto cut friction under 3 allied squads and pointed down slope. Slide, he said. No argument. They slid. Gravity liked being a ride rather than a punishment. E squads dropped under a white kite of Hashiras and popped up grinning like kids who had lied successfully to danger. Cute. Karen panted, hair stuck to her temple, hands black with ink and dried blood. Again. On your breath, Hinata warned, and Naruto heard the circumference of himself in her voice. He balanced the dawn and the dusk, the petals and the frost, and for a heartbeat everything in his chest stopped trying to win. The inverted sky didn't like losing an argument. A bright seam appeared in it like a smile drawn with a sharpened piece of winter. Shien's bell rang in Hinata's hand without being touched. It rang in Naruto's wrist where the circlet warmed. It rang under Samui's blade and Temari's fan and Karen's ink. It rang in Captain Kaneto's chest a final time as if to say you were honest, thank you. Nagi reached. There is no elegant way to describe it. It was not a person. It wasn't even a thing. It was a negative, a vacuum with good manners and a god's appetite. It took the color out of the air first. Because color is soft and likes to be led. It removed the motion from 3 hawks investigating the seam. Their hearts forgot what beating meant and sat there politely until someone told them. It stroked a mountain's shadow and the mountain's shadow stopped believing in afternoon and was only geometry. Aizen flinched. He didn't mean to. It was small and human and terrible. Nagi, he said, and there was devotion and dread in it, like a monk whispering a lover's name and a winter's. Naruto made wind chimes again and they made no sound this time because sound was being asked to take a nap forever. He tried one more law, the kind you sneak into a quiet room. Words spoken in good faith will carry farther. The words arrived and sat nicely and went nowhere because Nagi was in the habit of being everything in the room and had not been told it was rude. Temari bared her teeth, a sandstorm with a report due. Open your mouth, she told the wind. The wind opened. Nagi tucked 2 fingers into the wind's cheek and made it close. Hashira's eyes went wide and hot with the white panic of a man realizing he is not the biggest decision in the room. He flicked his hand in a cut across, ordering retreat while pretending he wasn't. Half his people obeyed, half didn't because obedience is friction and Nagi had very politely erased friction. Sazanami's hands clenched, in his pockets and then slowly unclenched. His face did something Naruto had not seen it do, it chose. The choice was ugly and perfect. He turned his back on Hashira and shouted in a voice used to be heard by people who survived. Down ridge. Grab the ropes. 3-2 breath. His soldiers obeyed without looking for permission he could no longer give. They slid at the same moment the coalition slid. For one compromised breath there were no sides, just people who didn't want to be erased, cooperating. Karen laughed into the wrong air like a lunatic. That's right, she told physics. We are more interesting. Samui's voice came bone dry. We're about to not be. The seam smiled wider. A white, soundless ocean poured out. Not water, not light, a flood of obedience. It sluiced across the inverted sky with the implacable pleasure of a law practiced to smoothness. Wherever it touched, color paled, sound blinked, breath tried to become someone else's idea. The banners stiffened, thrilled and terrified to be in the presence of their god. Hashira took a step as if to greet it and then another as if to run. Shien's bell howled. Naruto grabbed the stair with both hands like a man taking hold of the throat of a story intent on telling itself wrong. He jammed the dusk breath under the flood and erased the relationship between the white ocean and momentum. The flood paused mid-pour. It did not like being asked to think. It resumed, insulted. He erased the flood's confidence. It hesitated as if to ask if it had done this before. It had. It would. It did anyway. Hinata's voice reached him clean through the quiet. Naruto, she said. Not now. Not stop. Just his name like a bell rung true. Temari shoved wind under the stair with everything she had, teeth bared, arms shaking. Up, she snarled. We take the fight up. Get it away from the valley. Kumo, break right. Suna, left. Mist. Don't be artful, be efficient. Aizen took one step and was beside Naruto, not in alliance, not in treachery, just in accuracy. Your laws are good, he said, and it sounded like sorrow. They are not enough. We'll write bigger, Naruto said. Bigger isn't better, Aizen said. Better is better. We'll write better, Naruto snapped, and flashed him a grin so bright it cracked the wrong air a hair. A hair was enough for Hinata's breath to slip through and settle in Naruto's chest like a bird sitting in the exact tree it was hatched in. The white ocean advanced. Below, the land of iron's silver threads dulled, the birches turned into lines on a page. It reached for the stair like a polite invitation that had decided it would be rude to be refused. Naruto made one last small law, gentle as a palm set between shoulder blades. If someone reaches to be caught, that reaching counts as motion. White ocean took that into itself with the bewildered offense of a host told that guests may leave when they like. It did not stop. It slowed. Karen slapped a last tag, hands shaking, ink shining wet as if it loved her. You're on the clock, she told the universe, furious and aflame. We're all on the clock. Work faster. Samui put her sword under a seam that had given up pretending. This is a terrible staircase, she informed it. Affectionate. Don't you dare humiliate me. Hinata set the bell against her breastbone and breathed. The bell, for the first time since they'd begun to climb, went silent because there were no lies left to point at, only decisions. Tamari flung her fan and the wind obeyed not because she forced it but because she had been kind to it for years. Let's go write a better law, she said to Naruto. To the coalition, to anyone listening, including the thing that thought kindness meant turning all the lights off. He laughed, teeth white in the wrong light, the sea. Lift chalk now a private map under his ribs. Short sky, he said, and sprang toward the heart of the seam. Hashira watched them and understood, too late, that he had built a perfect machine for the wrong problem. He closed his eyes for one imperceptible beat, not to find peace but to avoid seeing himself in reflective surfaces later. Then he lifted his hand and doubled down, because that was the shape his spine had learned. Sazanami didn't look for permission. He hauled 3 of his own by their collars onto the ribs, shoved a 4th ahead of him, and breathed like a man who had decided to be unpromotable. The white ocean lifted its polite face. It was going to learn to be rude. Everything tilted. Color went thin as old paint. The birches below were ink lines. The snowmelt threads were erased down to their arithmetic. The wrong sky seam cracked like an egg. Through the crack, something looked back. A law that believed rest was love, reaching for a world that had never slept enough. It wanted to help. That made it worse. Naruto's hands tightened on stone that wasn't. Everyone hold, he said, and it wasn't an order. It was a gift to the part of the world that still wanted to. Write better. Shion whispered somewhere below, her voice lifting through the wrong air like incense. He nodded like a man agreeing to merry trouble and took another step into the spill of soundless white. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. A new law for the world. The white ocean lifted its polite face and came for them. Naruto felt the wrong cold climb his throat to sit on his tongue. He set his palms to the rib of the stair and pushed breath into it the way you encourage a tired friend to stand. The rib held. Barely. The seam in the sky smiled a little wider, like a host remembering an anecdote that ends in everyone falling asleep. Under. Hinata said. Not loud, and he heard the underlined part. Below you, below this. There, under the wrong sky's belly, the world had a pulse. He hadn't noticed it at first because it was honest and honest things do not show off. Now it called like sap in spring. Shion didn't shout. She put her mouth near Temari's shoulder and said, down. The world drooped. Tamari didn't ask where. She stabbed wind into the seam's edge and it buckled enough for Naruto to fold a step in on itself. The stair turned, vertebrae bending without breaking, and slid like a throat swallowing the wrong way. They fell. Not far. Not long. Just enough to change rooms. The worldroot had been hiding under the mountain the whole time, patient as an old tree that lets storms shred its leaves because it has the trunk for it. They dropped into a cavern bigger than any hall Naruto had seen, roots thick as towers braided through it in loops and arches, each one furred with bioluminescent threads that pulsed slow and deliberate. The air smelled wet and mineral. The sound behaved like a librarian, present, precise, uncluttered. Agreements hung everywhere. He could see them. Not laws the way men write them. All paragraphs and petty punishments. These were small and helpful. This is how a name fits a person. This is how water takes a curve if you don't shout at it. This is how gravity forg. Ives a stumble if hands are already reaching. A third of the threads had gone pale and brittle, like noodles left too long in a colander. Naji's white had infiltrated there, not violent, not fast, just confident, which was worse. The stare exhaled and was content to be unnecessary. Naruto let it dissolve politely. Their boots hit damp stone. The Worldroot took the weight without complaint. Karen went to her knees in the middle of the cavern's floor and struck chalk against stone. The sound was as crisp and rude as a match. She drew with both hands at once, spirals within spirals, lines cutting through the spirals at rational, infuriating angles. Chalk dust lifted. Blood beaded where her other palm had torn open earlier and fell in tiny suns. Don't, Hinata said, reaching. Karen shook her head, not unkind. If I don't feed the map a little of me, it will keep assuming I'm kidding. She flicked the chalk between her fingers in a quick, obscene flourish that made the lines link. Okay. World as circuit. Throats here, that knot. She jabbed the chalk toward a clot of white threads in the root above them. Is where Naji's quiet pretends to be mercy. We break its habit, not the knot itself. Distribution. Tamari said briskly, already sectioning the cavern with strips of cloth she'd had folded inside her vest. She anchored one to a root with a knot that looked decorative and was actually political. Kumo. Left line. Mist. Shadow arc. Rain. Med runners, stay behind the second chalk ring. Suna with me on crosswinds. If anything starts being a metaphor, I want 3 kunai in it immediately. Samui crouched by a glistening node where a cluster of agreements met like wires in a junction. She set the tip of her plain short sword into a seam and cried, hard enough to make the seam complain softly, then relent. Nullsteel grounding points, she said. 3-point pattern. If you try to write a new law without giving it somewhere to sit, it'll fall through the floor. Or our teeth. Sheehan stood beside the largest root like someone greeting an old friend who had withdrawn to spare both of them. She set her small bell on the wood. It made no sound. Her hands were steady, and her eyes had that particular brightness of a person who sees a knife coming and moves to be the one who holds it. Hinata held Naruto's gaze with the ease of a person who already knows his next 3 breaths. Balance, she said, which was less instruction and more a reminder that she would be here for whichever breath failed him first. Structure, Naruto said, because he had learned to lead with that and not with jumping. He tapped the chalk map. We isolate 3 agreements and rewrite them very small. We don't tell the world how to be. We remind it how to say yes to itself. Karen's grin was teeth. I could kiss you, she said. Tamari raised a brow. Later. Schedule is full. The white ocean found the mouth of the cavern with a sound like silk being folded in an empty room. It didn't pour in, it arrived. Color went thin around the edges of their chalk map. The roots nearest the entrance grew still in that bad way that looks like cleanliness until you notice the absence of bugs. Nagi did not show itself. It did not need to. It was every place the bell would have rung if lies were involved, but there were no lies here, only ideas with bad boundaries. Aizen stepped in as if he'd been there since before they arrived. His presence made the bell's wood cool. The dragon of stillness coiled around him like a winter cloak. Not cruel, not kind. Accuracy that had failed to ask permission. He looked at the chalk and the blood and the rooted light in Naruto's hands. You can't win by drowning it in kindness, he said, not derisive, earnest the way a burned hand is honest about flame. It will accept your courtesy and make it rule. Good, Naruto said. Then we won't drown it. We'll teach it to breathe. Sheehan had said. Define, don't argue. He planted his feet and set his palms on the chalk in 2 clean places. His breath balanced because Hinata was standing there and he had decided to be someone who listened to her first. He wrote the first law small and mean. Falling things will want to be caught. Not must. Want. Gentle like a dog taught to sit with patience and treats. The white at the mouth of the cavern hesitated. It didn't like wanting. Wanting implied incompleteness. Tamari saw the hitch and shoved a wind pattern into the opening with the surety of someone who did not believe in half measures. The current curled into a loop and held its shape as if air could have muscle memory. Wanting is fine, she told the quiet. Try it. Karen set her palm to the chalk and bled into the lines, fixing the law to the root network like tacks. Ink sprinted from her paw. G as if insulted by gravity and dove into the chalk trench. 1 down, she said. 2 makes a table stand. Samui moved to the first grounding point and knocked a nullsteel cladding into place with the hilt of her blade. The grounding ate the static in the air, the fizz that had been accumulating on their teeth. If this hums, tell me, she said. If it sings, I blame you, Uzumaki. It'll sing, Naruto said. We'll keep it on key. The white ocean pulled into the cavern, a swell with no interest in being anything but admirable. Somewhere far away, a child dropped a glass and it didn't break. Because the first law had stuck and because that child had reached to catch the glass in the first place. These things traveled, Nagi responded. It didn't roar or slap. It did that unbearable thing. It removed options. The chalk lines nearest the entrance erased themselves politely. Sound narrowed, colors abated. One of Karen's numbers decided it would like to be a 0 and sat there smugly. Shien's bell stayed quiet. No lie, the world was simply losing its curiosity. Hinata's breath touched Naruto's ear as gently as a hand. Now the second, she said. He wrote it, small and embarrassing, Becca. Use the most stubborn truths generally are. Words spoken in good faith will carry farther. You dress a law like that in wedding clothes if you want to make it pretty. Naruto dressed it in the voice of a market woman telling a neighbor what water level the ditch was, of a carpenter shouting, step, when someone came near the last plank, of a medic saying, breathe, because that is what you can do when you cannot do anything else. The white ocean bumped into that and discovered the fine print. If you were going to carry erasure across the world, you had to tolerate other things carrying too. It couldn't be everything in the room and be generous. It tried anyway. Somewhere beyond the cavern, a messenger's cry reached a hamlet one bend earlier than it would have. A rope was thrown sooner. Hands went out because someone had been heard. Hashira arrived with the bands. He came down the same tunnel as the white ocean, flanked by Astra cousins that hummed policy at the walls. He wasn't panting. A man like that never let the body do anything untidy in public. Behind him Sazanami's soldiers moved in that dangerous, efficient not quite chaos of professionals who know too well the value of a clear line and are fully capable of dirty work. Hashira took in the chalk, the blood, the bell, the cavern full of roots that insisted they were relevant. He arranged respect on his face like cutlery. Uzumaki, he said, this is the part where you get out of the way. Naruto looked up and grinned with true pleasure. Regent, he said, do you hear that? The bell didn't ring when you said it. Shien's mouth tilted. She didn't argue. Hashira's gaze slid to the bell, back to Naruto. His eyes changed an increment, the change of a man adjusting his expectation of the weather. He motioned. The bands, ribs unfolded, ready to revise the air into something more comfortable to paperwork. Tamari moved first because of course she did. Not your field, she said, snapping wind under Hashira's feet and taking away the smugness of height. She didn't strike him. She struck his certainty and made it spill a little. We're fixing your operating environment. Sit. Sazanami stepped left into Tamari's wind and dared it to move him. It moved him 2 inches. His mouth quirked like he'd been corrected by someone he liked. Procedure requires I arrest you, he said to Naruto, and something in his voice went raw around the edges for half a syllable. Decency asks me not to. Naruto pointed at the chalk. Put your hands here and be useful, Captain. The corner of Sazanami's mouth that had never been able to stop trying to be a joke almost did something human. He knelt and set his palms exactly where Naruto's fingerprints had smeared. The bell did not ring. The white ocean faltered at the mouth of the cavern and scowled without making a face. Karen stared at Sazanami like a cat realizing the furniture would tolerate another claw. If you mess my scansion, I'll write a footnote about you that makes historians take up smoking. Of course, Sazanami said. He didn't look at his regent. Hashira did not like being left out of the chain of command in his own moral emergency. He lifted his hand and the banners, ribs in the tunnel stiffened. Hungry to start naming and unnaming. Shien clanged the bell with a finger bone light. The sound went down people's spines and stopped where Lies sat. Hashira flinched. Not much. Enough. The bell had accused him of something and he had heard it. You like that you are necessary more than you like people being safe. It wasn't a courtroom. It was a mirror. His jaw worked. He lowered his hand, not because he had surrendered but because he was taking inventory in a way he hadn't since he was 19 and less tidy. Third law, Hinata said to Naruto, and her V. OICE was full of a kind of mercy that had nothing to do with erasing anyone. It's time. He made it with one palm on chalk and one on the world root itself. It wanted to be big. He made it smaller. Rest will not count as erasure. He didn't write, must. He wrote, will, not obligation. Consensus. Eisen breathed in like the first cold after a fever breaks. Something crawled along his shoulders and sat there a moment, ashamed. The white ocean did not like, will. It contradicted Nagi's favorite trick of removing choices until rest was the only option and then calling that mercy. It came in harder, not angrily, convinced. Samui hammered the second grounding point into place and looked at Naruto with the dry patience of a woman who has fixed too many machines built by beautiful idiots. I can conduct off some of the excess, she said. If you don't let me, I will be mad at your corpse. Please, Naruto said, and meant it. She drove the blade tip into the node seam and the grounding sang once. The low note of a household throne that is also a kettle. Tamari flung air to brace the third law where it was shaking like a baby deer. Karen's ink danced. Hinata's hand anchored Naruto's wrist. He leaned into that anchor and let the breath between dawn and dusk slip across his tongue like a swallowed coin. The white ocean reached them. It removed the color from Hinata's hair. It turned Tamari's fan into a diagram. It made Karen's numbers all zeros again. It stroked Samui's sword as if to erase steel's habit of cutting. Eisen, eyes high and far, moved. He stepped into the white and stood very still. It flowed around him the way water flows around a rock in a stream. Not because he was harder, but because he held stillness like a cup in the middle of stillness, wedge within wedge. Inside that pocket, Naruto felt motion come back as if it had never left. It was counterintuitive. It worked. Aizen's voice reached him from that hollow with the calm despair of a man admitting who he's praying to all his life is the wrong kind of silence. I let it erase me, he said, plain. I called it compassion. I was a coward wrapped in ceremony. Karen's mouth did not say, finally, but her eyes did and then forgave him without dignity. She slapped new tags down, hands shaking. Hold the slice, she told Aizen. One wedge buys us 15 beats, I'll make them count. Hinata's bell warma D against her breastbone and stayed quiet. There were no lies in that corner of the cavern now, only a man telling the truth because he wanted to live with himself later. Naruto lifted his chin. Petals dusted off his hairline. Frost pricked his lashes. He was tipping. He could feel it. Hinata's fingers closed and her voice hit like a tuning fork. Now, he inhaled. He breathed both breaths at once. Dawn, dusk, making and unmaking. He did not force them to marry. He let them hold hands and not be embarrassed about it. The air around his mouth went pale with cold and soft with glow. Petals and frost crossed, braided, negotiated. A third color surfaced, not light and not dark. Something like sea glass held up after a storm and found to be whole. He didn't aim it at Nagi. He aimed it at the agreements crushed under Nagi. He rewove them with his breath like he was a son of a village that taught him to mend nets because fish don't respect excuses. Here, edges will remember their job is to make holding possible, not to cut. There, names called in care will be heard across quiet. He nearly overreached on that one. Karen rapped his knuckles with 2 fingers without looking and muttered, small, idiot. And he laughed breathlessly and made it smaller. Above, the wrong sky seam continued to crack, a long hairline splitting eggshell. The sound that wasn't sound lifted from the world like a thread being pulled from a too tight collar. The white ocean surged to fill its own gaps and found that wanting to be caught made it slow down and that words spoken in good faith took the path first. And that rest could sit down without swatting anyone else off the bench. Tamari set her feet far apart, fan open, hair dragging loose at the temple where the fight had sweat the pins out. Crosswind now, she called to Wind, to Shinobi. To anyone in hearing, she toggled currents between roots, pressing the new laws into place the way a bookbinder presses leather into glue. Samui planted the last grounding point. Her sword hummed. She did not smile. Don't blow the breakers, she said, very mildly, and met Naruto's eyes in that way she had of being deadpan and caring. Sazanami's hand stayed on the chalk. He did not move when one of his soldiers cried out for him. He did not move when Hashira took 2 aching steps nearer to the door and then stopped because the bell made a tiny, private sound against the root under Xian's palm. He stood where he had been told to be useful and became invaluable. Hashira closed his eyes for one precise beat. Then he took his own hands off the banner commands and dropped the last of his devices to the floor like a man setting a knife down after cutting his own thumb. He did not announce it. He did not perform it. He simply refused to carry the weight that made him necessary. Good, Tamari said without looking at him. She never made a fuss about people doing what they were supposed to do. Nagi did not die. It folded. It went from ocean to weather, from everything to a part. It slid into the law Naruto was making the way a river slides into its own curve. The cavern didn't brighten so much as deepen. Shadows went from diagrams to places again. The bell hummed once, satisfied. Then quieted because other people could speak now without being summoned to be honest by God. Aizen crossed the last 2 steps and put his palm on the world root. He did not call stillness. He listened. The dragon of stillness coiled tight as a promise around his shoulders and laid its head down, not asleep, not erased, resting in a place that finally had a shape T. Hat did not require everyone else to vanish in order to be true. Rest is not absence, he said, and his voice broke right there, not from dramatics. From gratitude. The wrong sky cracked along its entire seam. A rain began, not the rude, drumming rain of summer tantrums. This was the sort that tasted clean when it hit your mouth, that made cobblestones darker and more themselves. The white faded out of it contentedly, compelled by the very small laws it had agreed to obey, wanting to be caught, hearing good words first, letting rest mean ready later, not gone. Naruto's knees wanted to give. He didn't let them. Hinata slid an arm around his waist in that anonymous way she had, like a person catching a tray at the edge of tipping. Karen tied a tag around his wrist that made his pulse tick like a metronome and smacked his shoulder when he tried to apologize. Tamari propped the back of his skull with 2 fingers for 1 second, practical and impersonal, and his whole body believed her about the ground. Samui checked the last grounding's heat with the back of her hand and then stepped away 3 measured paces, grimacing at paperwork that no longer existed. Xian breathed, and because she had given herself the job of crying later, she didn't now. She rang the bell with a soft knuckle and it didn't ring because there was nothing false to correct, it just warmed so hard it hurt. Hashira took off his glove. He looked at his hand like it was part of something again. He set the glove on a root and bowed. Not to Naruto, not to Xian, not to his own profession. To the world root, to the agreements he had been trying to keep alone with banners and schedule and this neatness that had turned on him. I am very tired, he said to no one and to everyone, simply. I don't get to be tired right now. So I will be tired later. Later, Sazanami said gently, because he would make sure there was a later where a tired man could be tired safely. He straightened up from the chalk and removed his hands like someone letting a bird out of a bag and hoping it doesn't hate him for how long it had to wait. The coalition didn't cheer. War people who have come to the edge and looked over rarely do. They stood in the damp ringing quiet of a world that had been very nearly convinced that quiet meant suffocation and now remembered it meant the absence of confusion so you can hear each other. Above, the scene went from crack to scar to nothing. The rain thinned. Somewhere far, ocean broke on rocks exactly when it was supposed to. They came up out of the world root in that same awkward, safe walk. Why you climb a ladder after the roof didn't cave? The mountain let them go without insisting on metaphors. The sky took them back like a school that had expelled them and then readmitted them because Hay brought a note signed by their own bones. Aizen stood with them on the ledge for a time that could have been a minute or the length of a prayer and then stepped off to stand by himself. He did not look damaged. He looked like a man who had put down an instrument he had been holding in the wrong song and intended to learn to play it in a room no one could hear until he was ready. He bowed to Naruto. The bow was not deep. It was accurate. Thank you, he said. For writing, will, instead of, must. I do not obey well. Same, Naruto said, smiling because relief makes boys of men. Go find a place where stillness isn't a weapon. Aizen's mouth softened. I will try, he said, and there was a joke in it, not yet good, worth working on. Hashira came without his banners. He did not put his hands up. He did not kneel. He stepped into Naruto's shade and said, I surrender my mandate here. I do not surrender responsibility. Keep your people from turning this into a story about how they were right, Tamari said, sore, frank. That's useful. He nodded. I can do useful, he said, and it might have been the bravest thing he'd done all week. Sazanami took a half step closer to Hashira and then half a step back. Because boundaries were a skill, he turned to Naruto. If I don't write you up, I will lose the part of my job that allows me to arrange ambulances. Write me up, Naruto said cheerfully. Use short words. He put out his hand. Sazanami regarded it, then shook it like a man accepting that not everything has to be neat to be good. They walked back to people who had been aiding and stayed and fought and made jokes to keep their hands from shaking while they held ropes for strangers. No victory parade. Too many names bristled around the edges of the day to make room for the word parade without lying. Night found them in a long, low room in the cliff below Suna's east wall, where a brazier glowed like an obedient dragon. Paper screens were half open to a square of stars. Someone had left a plate of cut fruit on the table next to a pile of reports that were going to be honest even if they were boring. Naruto ended up on the floor with his back against a pillar B. 'Cause his body didn't trust chairs right now. He stretched his legs. Hinata's head found his shoulder with the inevitability of a river finding its own dip. She was asleep 3 breaths later, insistent and small. And this time Shien's bell didn't ring because there was no lie in calling that trust. Tamari sat at the low table with a brush in hand and a sheaf of forms in front of her, scowling with devotion. I will never forgive paper, she said, dipping the brush with a neat flick. But I will keep rescuing it from liars. Samui sat opposite, sharpening silence into a little pyramid with her blade, deadpan as a hinge. I put in a request for 3 more people who know how to unstick screws that don't exist, she said. I will be ignored. I will file again. Karen came over with a blanket, and threw it over Naruto's lap so it covered Hinata too, without precision. If you pass out and drool on me, I'm boiling your jacket, she told him, affectionate and feral. She smoothed the corner of the blanket where it fell crooked and pretended she hadn't. Shien leaned in the doorway with her bell turned upside down in her palm like a cup. It made a tiny, satisfied hum and went quiet. Sleep, she said, which was a benediction here, not an order. Naruto didn't sleep right away. The warmth of Hinata's breath against his shirt created a small, powerful gravity. Tamari and Samui's dry bicker created a weather system that promised tomorrow would have crosswinds and receipts. Karen's breathing, shallow at first, lengthened as math relaxed into dream. Shien watched like someone who had sked a god the right favor and been given it, and now had to live with that, which is always more work than asking. He let his eyes close with care. The breath that was dawn and the breath that was dew. SK sat against each other like 2 tired dogs in a doorway, no longer needing to fight for who would sleep inside. He thought he might make a law tomorrow that said people who sit in the same quiet, after, should be allowed that kind of quiet without having to argue with the day for it. He wouldn't write it big. He'd whisper it into chalk. Dawn came. They stood later on a beach that was mostly rubble and grace. Uzushio's bones rose in wet teeth. Gulls wrote obscene prose in the air, delightful and uncompromising. The ocean took its cues like a professional and broke on time, the sound even, mathematically correct, human. Naruto walked down the slope of sand and let the water lace his boots. The world breathed. He crouched and drew a small spiral in the wet, neat and quick. It filled. It erased itself. He drew it again. Hinata stood at his shoulder with her hood pulled up against a wind that wasn't sorry for anything. Tamari and Samui argued out of habit over whether a report should lead. God encountered, before or after, weather, inclement. Karen declared both of them illiterate and stole the writing brush. Shien smiled like a woman whose bell was finally allowed to be a bowl for soup. Naruto looked at the spiral and didn't explain it to anyone. He stood, brushed sand off his palms on his pants because life is detail, and grinned out across a world that would always need too many small laws whispered into its roots. That was fine. He liked work that left his shoulders sore and his heart honest. Breakfast, he said, and the ocean agreed. Chapter 5 End.